About 11 years ago, when I was 16, my family took one of our annual ATV trips up to the North Woods in Wisconsin. These trips were the highlight of my summer. It was a chance to get out of the Chicago suburbs, away from the endless pavement and the hazy city glow that washed out the night sky. Up north, the air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and at night, you could see the Milky Way. My dad and stepmom would come, along with my stepbrother, and I'd always bring a couple of my best friends. This time it was Mark and Dave. We'd spend the days exploring miles of trails and the nights sitting around a campfire, feeling like we were a million miles from anywhere. This particular trip, we decided to try a new area we hadn't been to before. We pulled in with our truck and trailer, the ATVs strapped down tight, and found a campsite that looked decent enough. It was a standard state park campground, with gravel pads for campers and designated fire pits. We spent an hour or so getting everything set up. The small pop-up cabin for my dad and stepmom went up first, and then my stepbrother, Mark, Dave and I wrestled with our big multi-person tent, finally getting the poles in place and the rainfly staked down. The air was already starting to get that cool evening crispness to it, even though it was the middle of summer. After setting up, we were eager to hit the trails. We unloaded the ATVs, geared up, and took off. The excitement didn't last long. The trails in this area were a huge letdown. Instead of the winding, challenging dirt paths we were used to, with hills and mud pits, these were just wide, flat, gravel logging roads. They went on for what felt like forever in straight lines, flanked by endless rows of identical-looking pine trees. There was no one else out there. The only sound was the drone of our own engines. After about an hour of kicking up gravel and feeling more bored than adventurous, we all pulled over. We agreed unanimously that this wasn't what we came for. The plan was set. We'd head back to camp, have a fire, get some sleep, and then pack up first thing in the morning to find a different campground with better trails. Night fell quickly, the way it does in the woods. The sun just dropped behind the tree line and the world went from daylight to deep, dark blue. We had a small campfire, ate some hot dogs, and eventually my dad and stepmom turned in for the night, heading to their cabin. The four of us, me, my stepbrother, Mark, and Dave, crawled into our tent. But sleep wasn't coming. We were all still a bit restless and keyed up from the day, even if it had been a boring one. We told stupid jokes and talked for a while, but eventually, the silence grew. Lying there in the dark, I could hear every little sound from the forest outside, and the quiet from the rest of the campground was almost weird. It was pretty full, but there were no voices, no radios, no crackling fires. It was like everyone had gone to bed at 8 p.m. "I can't sleep," Mark finally whispered. The rest of us mumbled in agreement. "Let's go for a walk." We quietly unzipped the tent and slipped out into the chilly night air. The moon was only a sliver, but the stars were out in full force. We walked the main loop of the campground, our footsteps crunching softly on the gravel road. True to what we'd felt from the tent, the place was dead silent. Tents and RVs were dark and still. It was a bit eerie, but also peaceful. We finished the loop and ended up back near our campsite, but instead of going back into the tent, we stopped in a small clearing nearby and just looked up. Coming from the Chicago area, a sky like this was a spectacle. The sheer number of stars was overwhelming. You could see entire clouds of them, the Milky Way, a visible, shimmering band across the heavens. We all had our cheap little flashlights, the kind you get for a few bucks at a hardware store. Their beams were weak and yellowish, barely cutting through the immense darkness, but we used them to try and point out constellations. I was tracing the Big Dipper when I saw it, a single, steady point of light moving across the sky. "Hey, check it out," I said, pointing my flashlight beam near it. A satellite. The others found it, and we all watched it. It moved at a constant speed, in a perfectly straight line, not blinking like a plane. It was just a tiny, determined dot on a slow journey across the blackness. We followed it with our eyes and our weak flashlight beams. A silent, shared moment of observation. It traveled from one horizon, climbing higher and higher, until it reached the absolute center of the sky, directly above our heads. And then it stopped. It didn't slow down. It just came to a dead stop. For a second, we were confused. Satellites don't do that. Before any of us could even ask, "Did you see that?" The point of light exploded. It wasn't a violent explosion, but a silent, instantaneous blooming of pure white light. It was enormous, a perfect circle of brilliance that washed out the stars and lit up the entire campground as if it were the middle of the day. The light was shining directly down on the four of us, casting our short, sharp shadows on the ground around us. We were frozen, necks craned, staring straight up into the source. It wasn't like a spotlight. It didn't feel hot or even particularly harsh on the eyes, despite its intensity. It was just there, a solid, silent dome of white light. I remember seeing every detail around me with perfect clarity. The shocked, pale faces of my friends, their mouths slightly open. The texture of the bark on the pine trees at the edge of the clearing. The individual blades of grass at our feet. The most profound thing was the silence. There was no hum, no engine noise, nothing. Just this impossible light, and the four of us standing under it. I have no idea how long we stood there. It could have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes. Time seemed to have stopped. My brain wasn't even trying to process it. It was just observing, completely captivated. There was no fear, just a deep, profound sense of awe and disbelief. I don't remember any of us saying a word. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light was gone. It didn't fade. It just switched off, plunging us back into the deep dark of the woods. Our eyes, now useless, were still pointed upward. As we blinked, trying to adjust, we saw the original point of light again. It was in the exact same spot where it had stopped, and then it moved. It wasn't the slow, steady crawl from before. It darted. It shot across the remaining half of the sky, following its original path, but at a speed that was simply impossible. It covered the distance in maybe 2 seconds, a silent streak that our brains could barely register before it vanished over the opposite horizon. For a moment, we were all silent, the crickets and the wind, the only sounds. Then Dave finally whispered, "What was that?" We all just looked at each other, eyes wide in the gloom. The awe was gone, replaced by a sudden, creeping fear. We didn't say another word. We turned and practically ran back to our tent, fumbling with the zipper and piling inside. For the next hour, we talked in frantic whispers, trying to come up with any rational explanation. A military flare? A helicopter with a searchlight? A weather experiment? Nothing fit. A helicopter would have been deafeningly loud. A flare wouldn't have been so perfectly round, nor would it have moved like that before and after. We kept coming back to the same impossible conclusion. It was a UFO. There was no other word for it. The next morning, we told my dad and stepmom. They listened, and I could tell they thought we were exaggerating or had let our imaginations run wild, but they could also see that we were genuinely shaken. We quickly packed up our camp, eager to leave that place behind. We moved to a different campground a couple of hours away, one with the kind of fun, challenging trails we'd been looking for. The rest of the trip was normal. We rode our ATVs, had fun, and didn't see anything else unusual. The strangest part is that for several years after that, I barely thought about it. The memory just kind of faded into the background, which seems impossible for something so profound. But every now and then, it comes back. One of us will bring it up, and the other three will immediately know what we're talking about. We all remember it exactly the same way. The satellite that stopped, the silent, world-illuminating light, and the impossible speed of its departure. It remains the single most unexplainable thing I have ever witnessed. My dad is not a man who tells tall tales. He's a retired Navy SEAL, a person who has built his entire life on discipline, facts, and facing reality head-on, no matter how harsh. He's seen conflict in different corners of the world, and he carries himself with a quiet intensity that lets you know he's not easily rattled. He's always been strict, serious, and above all, truthful. He never saw the point in lying or exaggerating. That's why this one story, which I've only heard him tell 3 times in my entire life, always left me with a deep and lasting chill. He doesn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but he makes an exception for this, because he swears on his life that it happened exactly as he says. This took place a long, long time ago, at least 40 years back, when he was just a teenager in the early 70s. His grandparents owned a property with a big house, and behind it stretched a massive forest. We're not talking about a small patch of woods. This was hundreds of acres of dense, old-growth forest that felt ancient and untouched. As a kid who loved the outdoors and prided himself on being tough, my dad would often take a tent and camp out in those woods by himself. He'd hike out a fair distance, find a good spot, pitch his tent for the night, and then walk back to his grandparents' house in the morning for a big breakfast. It was his way of testing himself and finding some solitude. On this one particular summer night, he did just that. He packed a small bag with a flashlight and a sleeping bag, grabbed his tent, and told his grandparents he was heading out. He walked for maybe half an hour into the woods, far enough that he couldn't see the lights of the house anymore. He found a small, flat clearing, set up his simple canvas tent, and settled in for the night. The sun went down, and the forest came alive with the usual nighttime symphony, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. These were familiar, comforting sounds to him, and he fell asleep pretty quickly. Sometime deep in the middle of the night, he was pulled from his sleep. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was a sound that didn't belong. It was a heavy rustling in the bushes just outside his tent, accompanied by the distinct snap of a thick twig. His first thought wasn't fear. He was a confident, strong kid, and he immediately cycled through the logical possibilities. It was probably a deer or some other large animal passing through. Or maybe one of his cousins was trying to sneak up on him to play a prank and scare him. He felt a little annoyed, but not afraid. Deciding to confront whatever it was, he quietly reached for the tent's zipper. Without any hesitation, he unzipped the flap and pushed it open, stepping out into the cool night air. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale, silvery light over the clearing and filtering down through the canopy of leaves. And that's when he saw it. About 50 feet away, at the edge of the clearing, stood something that his mind simply couldn't process. His first impression was that it was shaped like a massive dog or a wolf, but it was standing upright on two powerful, digitigrade legs, like a wolf trying to imitate a man. It wasn't looking at him. Its head was tilted back, and it was staring directly up at the moon, perfectly still, as if in some kind of trance. The moonlight illuminated its form, and the details were unnervingly clear. He said it had a canine-like head, with strong, defined facial features, a long snout, pointed ears, but there was a disturbing intelligence in its profile. The most terrifying part was its physique. Its muscles were so large and dense that they looked exaggerated, like a comic book artist's drawing of a monster. The shoulders were impossibly broad, and the arms, which hung at its sides, were thick with corded muscle that looked powerful enough to rip a car door off its hinges. Its whole body was taut and coiled, radiating an aura of immense predatory power. He was completely frozen, a mix of shock and a primal fear he had never experienced before. He stood there in the silence, hidden in the shadow of his tent, convinced that the creature hadn't noticed him yet. Its attention was fixed entirely on the moon. Every instinct in my father's body, the same instincts that would later serve him so well as a SEAL, screamed at him that making his presence known would be a fatal mistake. This was not an animal he could scare away, or a prankster he could yell at. This was something else entirely. As slowly and silently as he possibly could, he began to back away, one careful step at a time, until he was back inside the opening of his tent. He lowered himself to a sitting position, his eyes still locked on the creature. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure it must be audible. He reached for the zipper, his hand shaking slightly, intending to close the tent and just pray it would move on. As his fingers touched the cold metal of the zipper, the creature's head snapped to the side. It turned and looked directly at him. Their eyes met across the moonlit clearing. My dad said in that 1 second, he felt a jolt of pure terror. a feeling of being seen and understood by something that was not of this world. There was no curiosity in its gaze, just cold, ancient intelligence. And then it was gone. It didn't just run, it vanished. In the literal blink of an eye, it dropped to all fours and launched itself into the dark woods with a speed that defied physics. There was no sound, just a blur of motion, and then nothing. He scrambled to his feet, peering out of the tent into the forest where it had been, trying to catch another glimpse, to hear its footsteps. But there was only silence. The clearing was empty, as if the creature had never been there at all. That was it for him. The tough kid act was over. Adrenaline surged through him, and he didn't even bother to take down his tent. He turned and ran. He sprinted through the dark woods, branches whipping at his face, not caring about the noise he was making, just needing to get back to the safety of his grandparents' house. He burst through the back door, gasping for breath, probably scaring his grandparents half to death. He never went camping alone in those woods again. In fact, he told me that for nearly 20 years, he felt a deep-seated reluctance to camp anywhere by himself. It wasn't until he had us, his own children, that he started camping again. And even then, he always seemed a little more alert, a little more aware of the sounds of the forest at night than a normal person would be. He never knew what he saw that night, but he was certain of two things. It was real, and he was lucky to be alive. If you went to school in California, you probably remember outdoor ed. It was a rite of passage for us in middle school. The school would bus us all out to a camp in the mountains for a week to learn about nature. For most of us, it was really just a chance to get away from our parents, hang out with friends, and have snowball fights. My school's trip took us up to the San Bernardino Mountains. It was late winter, and the ground was covered in a thick blanket of snow. The air was thin and cold, and the pine trees were heavy with it. Honestly, for the first few days, it was pretty boring. We did guided hikes, learned to identify a few types of trees, and sang dumb songs around a campfire. I was ready to go home, but then came the last night. What happened on that last night is burned into my memory so clearly that I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. I had always been a good sleeper. I could fall asleep anywhere, anytime. But that night, as I lay in my bunk bed in the drafty wooden cabin, sleep just wouldn't come. It wasn't just restlessness. There was a strange feeling in the air, a heavy sense of unease that had settled over the cabin. I thought at first that I was just homesick. It was my first time being away from my family for so long, and I was only in 6th grade. But then, I looked around the dark cabin. The moonlight coming through the window was just enough to see the shapes of my cabin mates in their own bunks. No one was moving, but I could feel that they were awake too. The silence was tense, thick with a shared, unspoken feeling that something was deeply wrong. Our counselor, a young college guy named Harley, who was probably only 19, was on a cot near the door. Even he was lying perfectly still, staring up at the ceiling. We lay like that in total silence for several minutes, and then we heard it. It started as a whisper, so faint that I thought it might just be the wind in the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, and it was calling our names. Not all at once, but one by one, drawn out in a soft, melodic tone. Jessica, it would whisper, then a pause, then, my child. It was coming from right outside our cabin. The voice itself was bizarre. It was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. It had an alluring, seductive quality to it, like it was promising something wonderful if we would just come outside. It made you want to go to it. A part of my brain felt drawn to that sound, curious and enchanted. But another, more primal part, deep in the back of my mind, was screaming at me. It was a gut feeling, a cold knot of terror that told me to stay in my bed, pull the covers over my head, and not make a sound. Apparently, Harley didn't have that same internal alarm bell going off. Or maybe he just felt responsible. He sat up, his silhouette dark against the window. What the hell? He muttered under his breath. He clearly thought it was a prank. The counselors from the other cabins were always trying to spook each other. He swung his legs out of his cot, pulled on his boots, and walked to the door. "I'll be right back, guys. Stay in bed," he said, trying to sound reassuring. He opened the cabin door and stepped out into the freezing night. We heard his boots crunching in the snow. "All right, very funny," he yelled out into the darkness. "Come on, guys. This isn't cool. The kids are trying to sleep. Whoever this is, knock it off." There was no response. The whispering had stopped. We just heard the sound of Harley walking around the perimeter of the cabin, his footsteps growing fainter and then louder again as he circled it. After a few minutes of total silence, the cabin door flew open and Harley rushed back inside, slamming it shut behind him. He was breathing heavily, and in the dim light, I could see his eyes were wide with panic. "Something, or someone, is out here," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't acting anymore. This was real fear. He quickly went to his duffel bag in the corner, unzipped it, and started rummaging around inside. He pulled out a large, heavy-looking pistol. Seeing a gun in our cabin was shocking enough, but the look on his face was what truly terrified me. He checked the magazine, chambered around, and without another word to us, went back outside, leaving the door slightly ajar. We all held our breath, listening. "Listen," Harley's voice boomed, much louder and more forceful this time. "This is your only warning. I don't know who you are, but I'm armed. If you intend to hurt these kids, I will shoot you." A dead silence followed his threat. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, the silence was shattered by the loudest noise I had ever heard in my life. Bang! A gunshot, deafeningly loud, echoing off the mountains. A second later, another one. Bang! Immediately after the shots, I could hear shouting from the other cabins. Doors opened and the other counselors came running, their voices a jumble of panicked questions. "Harley, what was that? What's going on?" I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but I could hear Harley's voice, high-pitched and frantic, trying to explain. A few minutes later, he came back into our cabin and shut the door firmly. He told us we had to stay inside and keep the door locked for the rest of the night. He wouldn't tell us what he saw. He just sat on his cot by the door with the gun in his lap, staring at the door until the sun came up. None of us got any sleep after that. The next morning, the whole camp was buzzing. We were all supposed to be packing up to go home, but everything felt chaotic and tense. As our buses were getting ready to leave, we saw police cars coming up the long, winding road to the camp. The officers got out and started talking to Harley and the other camp directors. It was only much later that the full story came out. Harley eventually told some of the other staff what he saw, and the story trickled down. He said that after he issued his warning, something stepped out from behind a large pine tree. He described it as something that only barely resembled a human being. It was impossibly tall, he said, well over 10 feet, and incredibly thin, with limbs that were too long for its body. Its skin was so pale white that he almost mistook it for the snow at first. He couldn't make out many facial features in the darkness, but he said it just stood there, looking at him. That's when he fired his gun. He said he didn't even aim. He just shot in its direction out of pure terror. As soon as the shots rang out, the creature turned and ran off into the woods with an unnatural speed, disappearing into the darkness. I've had nightmares about that voice, and about the thing Harley described ever since. My parents were furious when they found out what happened, and forbade me from ever going on a school camping trip again. I'm older now, and I've read a lot about strange creatures and folklore. My best guess for what Harley saw that night is something like a Wendigo. The only problem is, those legends are from the Great Lakes region and Canada. This happened in Southern California, thousands of miles away from where a creature like that is supposed to exist. But whatever it was real. It was smart enough to use our names, and it was close. Every summer, from the time I was a kid all the way through high school, I went to a place called French Creek Bible Camp. It was located deep in the woods of western Pennsylvania, miles from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where cell service was non-existent, and the nights were so dark you felt like you could touch the stars. I was in the oldest age group, for 11th and 12th graders, and by that point, I'd heard all the camp stories. Over the years, Legends were passed down from one generation of campers to the next, tales of strange things that lived in the surrounding woods. The most persistent legend was that of the Goat Man. The story changed depending on who told it, but the basic description was always the same. A creature that was half man, half goat, with glowing red eyes and a presence that felt like pure evil. It was supposed to look like the devil himself. Most of us treated it as just a spooky campfire story, something to scare the younger kids with. We certainly never believed a word of it. The camp layout was simple. There were 5 separate sleeping areas or units scattered throughout the property. Each unit consisted of a few rustic wooden cabins. Units 1, 2, and 3 were for the boys, and 4 and 5 were for the girls. Or at least, they used to be. A few years before my story takes place, something strange happened to Unit 5. One night, while camp was in session, the entire unit burned to the ground. The fire was intense and moved incredibly fast. Thankfully, everyone got out safely, but the cabins were reduced to nothing but ash and charred foundations. The weirdest part was that no one could figure out how the fire started. The cabins had no electricity, so it wasn't an electrical fire. The fire officials investigated and determined that it wasn't caused by a forest fire spreading to the camp either. It was a complete mystery, a dark spot in the camp's history that people whispered about. This particular summer, the summer I'll never forget, I was staying in Unit 4. After the fire, it was now the girls' unit that was the most isolated, the furthest from the main lodge and deep in the woods, right on the edge of the camp's property. The first few days of camp were normal. We had our daily activities, sang songs, and complained about the food. But then, a couple of nights in, something odd happened. I was asleep in my bunk when I was woken up by a loud bang. The heavy wooden door to our cabin had been thrown open with such force that it crashed against the interior wall. A couple of other girls woke up too. We all grabbed our flashlights, shining the beams out into the pitch-black night. We saw nothing. There was no one there. The air was completely still. There wasn't even a breeze. It was impossible for the wind to have done it. We nervously got up, closed the heavy door, and latched it. The next morning, we told some of the other campers what had happened, and we all had a nervous laugh about it, chalking it up to a weird prank or a freak occurrence. But it felt like a warning. 2 nights later, on the second to last night of camp, things escalated from strange to terrifying. It was late, probably around 2:30 in the morning. The night was perfectly calm and quiet again, no wind at all. I was sound asleep when I was jolted awake by the exact same sound as before, the loud, violent slam of our cabin door being thrown open. But this time, it was immediately followed by a sound I will never forget. It was an enormous, deafening cracking noise, like the sound of a giant bone snapping, that seemed to come from right outside our cabin wall. My bunk was right next to the window. In the split second of stunned silence after the crack, I instinctively looked outside. The moon was bright enough that I could see the silhouette of the massive oak tree that stood next to our cabin, and it was falling. It was falling directly towards us. In that same instant, as my brain was struggling to process the sight of a 100-foot tree about to crush us, I saw something else. A dark figure, tall and indistinct, was moving away from the base of the tree. It wasn't running like a person. It was just fleeing, melting back into the deeper shadows of the forest. I didn't even have time to scream a proper warning. I just yelled, "Get down!" The world exploded in a chaos of noise and splintering wood. The tree hit the roof of our cabin with a force that shook the entire structure. The roof collapsed inwards right over the bunk where my cabin mate was sleeping. If I hadn't looked out that window and seen it coming, giving her that split second to roll off her bed, she would have been killed instantly, crushed under the weight of the tree and the collapsing roof beams. Dust and debris filled the air. We were all screaming. Within seconds, campers and counsellors from the surrounding cabins came running, their flashlight beams cutting through the dust-filled darkness. They helped us all get out of the wrecked cabin, checking to make sure everyone was okay. Miraculously, aside from a few scrapes and a whole lot of terror, no one was seriously hurt. Once we were all safely outside, one of the counselors went to look at the base of the fallen tree. His flashlight beam landed on the stump, and he just stood there in silence for a moment. Then he called the camp director over. We all gathered around to look. The base of the tree wasn't splintered or broken like a tree that had fallen in a storm would be. It was cut. There was a clean, straight cut all the way through the massive trunk, as if someone had taken a chainsaw to it. But that was impossible. We were right there. The tree was no more than 10 feet from our cabin wall. We would have heard a chainsaw. It would have woken up the entire camp. There was no sound of an engine, just the slam of our door and then the crack of the wood giving way. Someone, or something, had managed to cut through a massive oak tree silently and deliberately, aiming it perfectly to fall on our cabin. The door being thrown open wasn't random. It felt like an announcement, a way to make sure we were awake for it. That night, I truly believed that the goat man, or whatever haunted those woods, was real, and that it had tried to kill us. My parents didn't even wait for the camp session to end. I called them from the director's office first thing in the morning, and my mum drove the 3 hours to come and get me right away. I packed my bags, said goodbye to my friends, and left French Creek Bible Camp for the last time. I have never been back. This happened about 20 years ago. My buddy Donnie and I were avid hikers and spent a lot of our free time exploring different sections of the Appalachian Trail. On this particular trip, we were in northern Georgia in the early spring. The woods were just starting to come back to life, but there was still a chill in the air and the weather was unpredictable. We planned a short weekend trip, hiking in a few miles to a spot we'd heard about called Indian Graveyard. The name was more dramatic than the reality. It wasn't an actual burial ground. It was a large, natural clearing on the side of a mountain that was filled with the stumps of old-growth trees. Years ago, some kind of blight or insect infestation had killed them all, and what was left were dozens of weathered, grey stumps of varying heights scattered across the clearing. In the misty mountain light, they did look eerily like gravestones in an ancient, forgotten cemetery, so the name fit. It was a secluded and peaceful spot, and we were excited to camp there. We made it to the clearing by late afternoon, set up our 2-man dome tent near the center, and made a small fire to cook dinner. As evening settled in, the weather started to turn. The wind picked up, howling through the trees that surrounded the clearing. It was a strong, gusty wind that made the tent fabric flap violently and sent leaves skittering across the ground. It was noisy and a bit unsettling, but it was just weather, nothing to be too concerned about. We finished our meal, cleaned up, and crawled into our tent to get out of the wind and get some sleep. The wind was so loud it was hard to even talk. We just settled into our sleeping bags, hoping it would die down by morning. We had been lying there for maybe half an hour when, all at once, the wind just stopped. It wasn't a gradual tapering off. It was like someone had flipped a switch and turned the sound off. 1 second the world was a roaring chaos of wind, and the next there was an absolute profound silence. It was the kind of dead quiet that feels heavy and unnatural, where you can hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Donnie and I both sat bolt upright in our sleeping bags at the exact same time. We looked at each other in the darkness of the tent, our eyes wide. That sudden silence was far more alarming than the wind had been. We were both thinking the same thing. Maybe this was the calm before a really bad storm, like a tornado. As we sat there, straining our ears in the oppressive silence, we heard a new sound. Footsteps. They were outside the tent, moving slowly and deliberately on the soft earth and leaves. They started on the right side of the tent. Slow, heavy steps. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. The footsteps continued, circling around the back of the tent, and then started up the left side. Each step was measured, unhurried. This was not an animal. Animals don't walk in perfect circles around a tent. This was something on 2 legs. The footsteps finally stopped right in front of the tent's zippered entrance. We were completely frozen, paralyzed with fear. My heart was hammering in my chest. Who could possibly be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night? All the terrible possibilities flooded my mind. A crazy person, a robber, someone who meant us serious harm. We just sat there, barely breathing, waiting for the tent zipper to move. Suddenly, without any warning, Donnie let out a ferocious yell that just about made me jump out of my skin. "You better get the hell out of here," he screamed at the top of his lungs. "I have a gun, and I'll blow your damn head off." He did not in fact have a gun. We had a camping knife, and that was it. His sudden, aggressive bluff scared me almost as much as the footsteps had. He told me later he figured if it was just some local redneck trying to mess with us, a threat like that might be enough to scare them off. What happened next was not what either of us expected. In the instant after Donnie's voice stopped echoing, a light flared up directly outside our tent. It wasn't a flashlight beam. This was a huge, perfectly round orb of light, about 10 feet in diameter, hovering about 10 feet off the ground. It was a blindingly bright white light, so intense that it illuminated the inside of our orange tent like it was broad daylight. We could see the light clearly through the thin nylon fabric, a perfect, glowing circle right where the footsteps had stopped. It just floated there, completely silent, not moving, not flickering. It was just an impossible sphere of brilliance hanging in the dead silent air. We stared at the glowing wall of our tent, speechless. The fear I'd felt from the footsteps was replaced by a sense of utter bewilderment. This made no sense. It felt like we were in this state for hours, just sitting there, bathed in the silent, white glow. Then, with no warning at all, the light vanished. It didn't fade out. It just ceased to exist. In the exact same microsecond that the light went out, the wind came roaring back, just as loud and violent as it had been before. It was as if someone had flipped the switch back on. That was all the motivation we needed. "We have to go. Now," Donnie said, his voice shaking. We only had one working flashlight between the two of us. We didn't even think about our gear. We abandoned the tent, our sleeping bags, our cooking supplies, everything. We scrambled out of the tent into the windy darkness and just ran. We bolted out of the clearing and down the trail we had hiked in on, stumbling over rocks and roots in the narrow beam of the single flashlight. It was nearly a mile back to the car, and we ran the entire way, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror, not daring to look back. We burst out of the woods into the small gravel lot where we'd parked. We jumped in the car, locked the doors, and Donnie peeled out of there. We drove about 8 miles to the nearest town, a little tourist place called Helen, and parked in a well-lit public parking lot. We didn't talk much. We just sat in the car, hearts still racing, until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, we drove back to the trail. We had to get our expensive gear. We walked back to the campsite, feeling incredibly nervous, half expecting to find it ransacked or gone. But everything was just as we had left it. The tent was still standing, untouched. Nothing was missing. But as we got closer, we noticed something strange. All around our tent, in a nearly perfect circle, the ground had been disturbed. There were small, round holes poked into the earth. Each hole was about 1 inch in diameter and looked to be about 6 inches deep. They were evenly spaced, maybe a foot apart, encircling the entire tent. It looked like someone had taken a broom handle and systematically pushed it into the ground, over and over again. We had no explanation for it. We didn't linger. We packed up our camp as fast as we possibly could, throwing everything into our packs, constantly looking over our shoulders at the silent, watching woods. We hiked out of there and went straight home. I have never been back to Indian graveyards since that day, and I never will. I live in Finland, a country where the forest is never far away. It's a huge part of our culture and our landscape. Growing up, I spent a lot of my time outdoors. When I was about 13, one of my favorite things to do was go cross-country biking on the trails near my home. There was one particular path I rode all the time. It was a loop, about 2 kilometers long, that wound through a dense section of pine and birch forest. It was a proper single-track path, narrow and challenging in some spots with roots and rocks, but mostly rideable and a lot of fun. I knew that trail like the back of my hand. One sunny afternoon, I headed out for a ride. I entered the forest where the trail began, the air immediately cooling and smelling of pine and damp earth. I had only been riding for a few minutes, navigating a narrow, straight section of the path, when I saw a figure up ahead. It was walking in the same direction I was going, away from me. It looked like a very old lady. She was wearing a dark hooded coat or cloak that covered her completely, and she was walking very, very slowly. I couldn't see her face or her hands, just the shape of her and the dark hood over her head. My first thought was that she was unusually tall for an elderly woman, but I was 13 and not very tall myself, so my perception might have been skewed. I continued riding, getting closer to her. My plan was to just call out a friendly hello and pass her. But the path was so narrow right there, with thick blueberry bushes crowding in on both sides, that there was no room to go around. As I got closer, maybe 10 or 15 meters behind her, I was hit with a powerful and unexpected feeling. It was a heavy sensation in my chest, a primal sense of dread that told me very clearly, do not pass her. I can't explain it logically, but every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong with this situation. I slowed my bike to a stop and got off, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I just stood there on the path, watching her continue her slow, deliberate walk away from me. After a moment, I started to feel ridiculous. It was just an old woman out for a walk. She would probably be startled if she turned around and saw a kid just standing there, staring at her. Trying to act casual and dismiss the weird feeling, I decided to create a reason for stopping. I bent down and pretended to be interested in the blueberries. I reached into the bushes, picked a single ripe one, and popped it in my mouth. It took maybe 5 seconds. When I stood up and looked back down the path, she was gone. I blinked, confused. I could see the path stretching out ahead of me for at least 50 meters before it curved. It was a perfectly straight line. There was no way she could have covered that distance in the 5 seconds I was looking down, especially not walking at the slow pace I had seen. My logical brain tried to find an answer. She must have stepped off the path into the woods, but the bushes and trees on either side were incredibly thick and dense right there. It would have been a struggle for anyone to push through them, let alone an elderly woman, and I hadn't heard a single sound, no rustling or breaking branches. I felt a little creeped out, but I told myself not to be silly. I got back on my bike and started riding again, pushing the uneasy feeling away. I rode for another 500 meters or so, the path twisting and turning, until I came to a small, rocky cliff. From the top of this cliff, you got a great view of the next section of the trail, as it descended into a small valley and continued on. I stopped at the top for a moment to catch my breath and looked down. And there she was. Down in the valley, at least 500 meters ahead of me, was the same figure. A tall person in a dark, hooded garment, walking slowly along the path. I still couldn't see a face, but it was unmistakably the same person. My blood ran cold. It was absolutely, physically impossible. To get to that spot, she would have had to travel the same 500 meters of winding trail that I just had. Even on my bike, moving at a decent speed, it had taken me a few minutes. For her to have gotten there, walking at that funereal pace, was impossible. She would have needed to be able to run faster than an Olympic sprinter. Now I was genuinely alarmed. The heavy feeling in my chest returned, stronger this time. But I was on a loop trail. The fastest way back to the start was to keep going forward. So, with a deep sense of dread, I continued. I rode my bike down the hill from the cliff, my eyes scanning the path ahead. I pedaled hard, wanting to get to the spot where I'd just seen her, to prove to myself there was some logical explanation. I reached the bottom of the valley in less than a minute, and there was nothing. This part of the forest was much more open, with thinner trees and less undergrowth. I could see for a good distance in every direction. She was nowhere to be seen. She had been right there just 30 seconds before, and now she had vanished into thin air again. My heart was pounding. I rode the rest of the loop as fast as I could, just wanting to get out of the woods. I finally burst out of the trees at the trailhead where I had started, back in the familiar sunshine. I felt a wave of relief. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. To prove it, to conquer the fear, I made a stupid decision. I decided to ride the loop one more time. I turned my bike around and headed back onto the trail. I rode for just a couple of minutes, back to the very first narrow, straight section of the path. And there she was, in the exact same spot where I had first seen her. Tall, dark, and hooded, walking at the same impossibly slow pace, moving away from me. That's when I lost it. I didn't think, I just reacted. I yanked my bike around so hard I almost fell, and I pedaled out of those woods with every ounce of strength I had. I didn't stop until I got to my friend's house, which was even further away from the woods than my own home. I was in a total panic, breathless and terrified. I never rode that trail alone again. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. I don't know if it was a ghost, some kind of forest spirit from old Finnish folklore, or something else entirely. All I know is that the image of that tall, slow-walking, hooded figure is something that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. When I was 13, I got into some trouble. It was nothing too serious, mostly behavioral issues, acting out, and being a general pain for my parents. They decided the best course of action was to enroll me in a wilderness treatment program. It was one of those tough love places where they send troubled teens out into the wilderness to build character and learn discipline. The program was located deep in the mountains of southern Utah, a rugged and isolated landscape of canyons, mesas, and sparse forests. We were based near a place called Joe's Camp, which was really just a designation on a map, not an actual town. A lot of strange, unexplainable things happened to me and the other kids out there, but one experience in particular has stuck with me. It freaked me out so much that, even now, I can still physically feel the terror of that night. One evening, our group was sitting around the campfire. The sun had set, and the temperature was dropping fast. The only light came from the dancing flames, which cast long, flickering shadows into the surrounding darkness. To pass the time, we started telling scary stories. Inevitably, the topic of the Wendigo came up. For those who don't know, a Wendigo is a creature from Algonquian folklore, a malevolent, cannibalistic spirit that is said to possess humans and inhabit cold, northern forests. Some of the other kids, who were from more rural areas, swore up and down that Wendigos were real. They told stories they'd heard from their grandparents about strange disappearances and creatures seen in the woods. One of the staff members, a guy who had grown up in the area, added fuel to the fire. He said that while the Wendigo was traditionally a northern legend, there were similar stories from local Native American tribes about tall, emaciated, predatory spirits that haunted these very mountains. We all bantered about it, some of us scared, others skeptical. I, being an edgy 13-year-old trying to act tough in front of my peers, decided to be dismissive. I blurted out something incredibly stupid, something you should never say out loud in the middle of the dark wilderness. "Screw Wendigos," I announced loudly. "They're not real, and if one ever showed itself to me, I'd kill it with my bare hands." The staff member gave me a look, a slight shake of his head that said, "Don't tempt fate, kid," but I just smirked, feeling proud of my bravado. Later that night, I was zipped up in my sleeping bag inside my small, one-person tent. I fell asleep, and I had a dream. It was one of those hyper-realistic dreams that feels more like a memory than a fantasy. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of a clearing in the woods, watching a deer graze peacefully. But the scene wasn't peaceful at all. I was filled with the most overwhelming sense of doom and dread I have ever felt in my life. A certainty that something horrific was about to happen. Then, in an instant, the deer was just gone. It didn't get attacked. It was obliterated. It was as if a giant, invisible boulder had dropped from the sky and completely crushed it. The dream showed me the gruesome aftermath in vivid detail. The deer was just a flattened mess of gore. Then, in the dream, the deer's spinal cord shot out from the wreckage like a spear and flew across the clearing, impaling me straight through the chest. I felt it. I actually felt the sensation of being impaled in the dream. It was the most bizarre and awful pain imaginable. It wasn't a sharp pain, but a dirty, scraping, grinding feeling, like being pierced by something jagged and rotten. The dream then shifted. I was now looking down at my own feet at the far end of my tent, as if seeing through my own eyes. Suddenly, I felt myself being violently ripped out of the tent, feet first, dragged by an unseen force. The sensation was so violent that I woke up instantly. But I wasn't in my tent. I was sitting bolt upright in my sleeping bag outside, a few feet away from the tent's entrance. The cold night air was a shock against my skin, and I was making a noise. It was the strangest, most terrifying sound I have ever heard come from my own body. It wasn't a scream or a cry. It was a high-pitched, wheezing screech, a primal, guttural sound of pure terror and death. It sounded like an animal dying. The sound I was making snapped me back to full awareness. I looked around frantically. The campfire was just glowing embers. The other tents were dark and silent. I was alone in the cold darkness. I scrambled on my hands and knees, dragging my sleeping bag with me, and dove back into my tent, fumbling to zip it closed. My heart was pounding out of my chest, and the horrible scraping pain from the dream still lingered as a phantom sensation in my chest. I lay there for the rest of the night, wide awake, listening to every snap of a twig, convinced that something was circling my tent. I tried to rationalize it. It was just a vivid nightmare combined with an episode of sleepwalking. The story about the Wendigo must have gotten into my subconscious. That had to be it. I didn't tell anyone about it the next day. How could I explain it? Hey, I had a bad dream and woke up screaming outside my tent. I would have been ridiculed, but the explanation of a nightmare and sleepwalking never felt right. It doesn't explain the sheer physical reality of the experience, the feeling of being impaled, the sensation of being dragged, and waking up outside my tent making a sound that didn't feel human. It felt like I had provoked something that night with my arrogant words, and it had decided to give me a little warning, a taste of the terror it could inflict. It definitely jarred me, and I never spoke so disrespectfully of the unknown again. This whole thing started out as a pretty standard guys' camping trip. A few friends and I had driven up into the mountains for the weekend. The plan was simple: set up camp, do some shooting, drink some beer, and generally get away from it all. The first night was a success. We sat around the fire, had a few too many drinks, and eventually crashed in our tents. The next morning, we all woke up feeling a bit rough. The sun was already beating down, and the thought of trying to cook breakfast over a fire seemed like way too much effort. Someone suggested we just drive into the nearest town and find a diner. It sounded like the best idea in the world. We all piled into my old pickup truck, hungover and hungry, and started down the long dirt road that led from our campsite back to the main highway. We were maybe a mile from the paved road, just coming around a bend when we saw them. The road ahead was completely blocked by a line of sheriff's vehicles, lights flashing silently in the morning sun. There were at least a dozen deputies, all in full tactical gear. 2 of them were positioned behind the open doors of their cruisers, and they had rifles pointed directly at our truck. We immediately slammed on the brakes, stopping a good 40 feet away from the roadblock. The whole scene was surreal. We were just some guys looking for pancakes, and now we were in what looked like a war zone. Before we could even process what was happening, a voice boomed over a bullhorn. "Driver of the blue truck, stick your hands out the window, now." My hands started shaking as I slowly rolled down the window and put my hands out where they could see them. The voice then instructed all of us to do the same. One by one, we were ordered to get out of the truck, keep our hands in the air, and walk slowly towards them. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, walking towards a line of heavily armed men who looked like they were ready to shoot at the slightest provocation. They had us lie face down on the dirt road while a few deputies searched my truck. Of course, they found it loaded with our camping gear, a cooler full of beer, and several rifles and shotguns we'd brought for target practice. From their perspective, we must have looked like the worst kind of trouble. After a tense few minutes of questioning, they seemed to realize we were just clueless campers. A sergeant came over and explained the situation. A US Forest Service agent had been shot and killed nearby just a few hours earlier. They were hunting for the murderer, who was believed to be armed, dangerous, and still in the area. Our campsite, and everything in it, was now officially part of a massive crime scene. They eventually let us go, but with a warning. We were not allowed to go back to our campsite. All of our expensive gear, tents, sleeping bags, coolers, everything, had to be left behind until the suspect was caught and the area was cleared. We couldn't just go home and leave thousands of dollars worth of equipment in the woods. So, we did the only logical thing a group of hungover guys in our early 20s could think of. We drove to the nearest Indian casino to wait it out and continue our party. We spent the next few hours at the casino, losing a little money at the blackjack tables and trying to piece together what was happening from news snippets on the TVs above the bar. The atmosphere was tense. The casino was on high alert, and you could feel the anxiety in the air. A few hours later, someone ran into the casino shouting that the police were outside. We all went to the main entrance to look. The sight was unbelievable. The casino was completely surrounded. There must have been 100 law enforcement officers from every agency imaginable. Local police, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, FBI agents, all swarming the parking lot, setting up a perimeter. It was a massive show of force. The story quickly spread through the casino. The murderer they were looking for had driven to the casino's gas station to get fuel. A sharp-eyed local police officer who was filling up his own cruiser recognized the man from the description that had been broadcast to all law enforcement. The officer drew his weapon and confronted the suspect. The suspect went for his own gun. There was a shootout right there, between the gas pumps. The suspect shot and killed the police officer, his second murder of the day before fleeing again. We were essentially locked down in the casino for a while as the massive manhunt continued in the surrounding area. They eventually caught the guy later that day. The next morning, the police cleared us to go back and retrieve our gear. We drove back down that same dirt road, which was now quiet and empty. We packed up our camp in silence, the fun of the trip completely gone. When I got home, I looked up the news articles about the whole incident. They included a map showing the timeline of the events. That's when I felt a real chill go down my spine. The location where the Forest Service agent had been murdered, the event that kicked off the entire manhunt, was only a quarter of a mile down the road from where we had been sleeping. We had been camped out, drinking beer around a fire, completely oblivious, while a killer was on the loose just a few hundred yards away in the darkness. I was 13 when this happened, an age where you're old enough to feel independent, but still young enough for the darkness to hold real terrors. My family and I were on a camping trip in Michigan, somewhere in the rolling hills near Mount Sugarloaf. I was a terrible insomniac as a kid. Most nights I'd be lucky to get a few hours of sleep, so I always came prepared with books or comics to get me through the long, quiet hours. On this particular night, around 3 in the morning, the rest of my family was fast asleep in our large canvas tent. My parents were on one side, and my little sister and I were on the other. True to form, I was wide awake, lying in my sleeping bag and reading a comic book with a small flashlight. The only sounds were the gentle breathing of my family and the chirping of crickets outside. It was peaceful. Then I heard a new sound. It came from the back edge of our campsite, where the manicured clearing met the dense, dark woods. It was the distinct sound of twigs snapping under a heavy weight, followed by the rustling of dry leaves being pushed aside. My head snapped up from my comic book, and I immediately switched off my flashlight, plunging the tent into near total darkness. I held my breath, listening. It's hard to describe the feeling that came over me. It wasn't immediate fear, not the kind that makes you want to scream. It was a deeper, more primal feeling. I felt hyper-aware, every one of my senses suddenly dialed up to its maximum setting. I imagine it's how a rabbit feels when it freezes in an open field, sensing that a hawk is circling overhead. It was an instinctual recognition of a predator. Without even consciously thinking about it, I remember slowly, silently, flipping over onto my stomach and inching closer to my little sister, who was sleeping soundly against the outer wall of the tent. Looking back, I think I was instinctively trying to put my body between her and whatever was out there. The sound got closer. The steps were slow and deliberate, not the frantic scampering of a small animal. They were muted, heavy footfalls that told me whatever was making them was big. By this time, I was practically lying on top of my sister, my eyes stretched as wide as they could go, desperately trying to see something, anything, through the thin canvas of the tent. The moon was out, but it was partly cloudy, and only a dim grey light filtered through, and that's when I saw it. The pale light of the moon cast a massive shadow onto the tent wall, right next to where my sister and I were lying. It was just a dark shape against the grey canvas, but it was huge. It was hard to make out specific details, but it looked like it had a long snout and tall, pointed ears. It was much too big to be a coyote or a dog. My mind immediately went to a bear, but the shape wasn't quite right. Then I could hear it. I could hear its fur, or maybe its skin, brushing against the outside of the tent. A soft shh sound. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel the pressure in my ears. The thing was sniffing. I could hear deep, wet inhalations right on the other side of the fabric. I could even feel the warmth of its breath through the thin barrier of the tent wall, the only thing separating me and my sister from it. In that moment, I was absolutely certain that this thing could tear through the tent and slaughter both of us in seconds. I was completely paralyzed by a kind of horror I had never known existed. All I could do was lie there, rigid, waiting for the inevitable. Suddenly, the shadow changed. The creature stood up on its hind legs. The shadow grew impossibly tall, curving up the side of the tent and onto the roof. I just waited. I waited for my life to flash before my eyes, for the sound of claws ripping through canvas. But my mind was empty. There were no thoughts, no plans, no prayers. There was only a pure, abject terror, the likes of which I have never, ever felt again in my life. But the attack never came. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the tall shadow just slowly moved away. It disappeared from the roof of the tent. I heard the underbrush rustling again, the same heavy footsteps, but this time they were moving away, back towards the deep woods, until the sound faded into nothing. Whatever it was, it had chosen to leave. The only thing that convinced me afterward that I hadn't been hallucinating or dreaming was the memory of that sound, the brushing against the tent, and the rustling leaves as it walked away. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, every muscle tensed, convinced it was going to come back. It didn't. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my parents. How could I explain it without sounding like a kid with an overactive imagination? But the experience changed me. I have refused to go camping anywhere in the Midwest ever since. I don't know what was outside my tent that night. Some people have suggested a bear on its hind legs, or maybe something like the Michigan dogman from local folklore. But I know it was big, it was close, and it was terrifyingly real. I grew up in a very rural part of Arkansas, the kind of place where your nearest neighbor is a mile down a gravel road, and your backyard is basically just the beginning of a vast, untamed forest. Our property bordered hundreds of acres of dense woods, full of oak and hickory trees. Seeing wildlife was just a part of life. We'd see deer, raccoons, opossums, and occasionally hear coyotes yipping in the distance. We also had a dog named Shadow, a big black lab mix who was the best dog a kid could ask for. She always stayed outside, and she was fiercely protective of our home. No coyotes or bobcats ever dared to come onto our property because Shadow was always on guard. One summer night, when I was about 12 years old, I had a friend stay over. We begged my parents to let us sleep in a tent in the backyard, and they finally agreed. We set up the tent a good distance from the house, right on the edge of the yard where it met the woods. We felt like real adventurers. Shadow curled up on her dog bed on the back porch, a silent guardian watching over us. As night fell, my friend and I were in the tent with our flashlights, reading scary stories from a book I'd gotten at the school library, and talking about boys and other middle school stuff. It was a typical sleepover. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard it. It was a sound that cut right through the chirping of the crickets and the peaceful night air. It sounded, for all the world, like a woman screaming. It wasn't a short shriek, but a long, drawn-out scream filled with agony and terror. It sounded like it was coming from the woods, not too far from our house. I immediately froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. The scary stories we'd been reading were forgotten. This was real. My dad, an experienced hunter and outdoorsman, had told me many times about the strange sounds of the woods, and one of his warnings always stuck with me. If you're ever out in the woods and you hear what sounds like a woman screaming, you get back to the house as fast as you can. That's a mountain lion. My friend, who was a town kid, didn't know this. Her first reaction was panic for a different reason. "Oh my God, what was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "That sounded like a woman. She's in trouble. We have to help her." She started to unzip the tent. I grabbed her arm. "No, stop!" I hissed. "We can't go out there." "Why not? Someone needs help," she insisted, her voice trembling. I was trying to explain to her that we didn't have any female neighbors for miles, that no one would be out walking in these woods in the middle of the night. I was trying to tell her what my dad had said about mountain lions when, at that exact moment, we heard a new sound, right outside our tent. It was Shadow. She was letting out a low, deep growl, the kind I had only heard her make a few times in her life when she was facing a serious threat. I have probably never been so terrified in my life, before or since. Her growl was a confirmation that the danger was real, and it was close. She started barking, a furious, aggressive volley of barks, and we could hear her paws scrambling in the dirt as she moved away from the tent, charging in the direction of the woods where the scream had come from. Suddenly, the back porch light of the house flipped on, flooding the yard with yellow light. The back door was thrown open, and my dad did one of those incredibly loud, high-pitched whistles with his fingers that could stop a dog in its tracks. He came running out of the house and towards our tent. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just his pajama pants, but in his right hand, he was holding a pistol. "Get out of the tent! Get to the house! Now!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the air with an urgency I'd never heard from him before. We didn't need to be told twice. My friend and I scrambled out of the tent and sprinted across the yard to the house, not daring to look behind us. My dad stood between us and the woods, the gun held at the ready, watching the dark tree line as Shadow continued to bark ferociously. We got inside, and he backed his way to the house, calling for Shadow, who finally broke off her barking and ran back to the porch. We slept inside that night, huddled together in my room, listening to every sound from outside. A few weeks later, my dad and I were driving down the gravel road near our house. We were heading to a big dirt pit about a half a mile from our property, where we would often do some target practice. As we came around a bend, my dad slowed the truck to a stop. He pointed across the pit. "Well," he murmured, his voice quiet, "that must be your friend." There, on the far side of the pit, perched on a high dirt mound, was a massive mountain lion. It was bigger than I could have ever imagined, a sleek, powerful creature of pure muscle. It was just sitting there, watching us, its long tail twitching slightly. It was beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. It stared at us for a long moment, then turned and gracefully disappeared back into the woods. I have never seen another mountain lion in the wild since that day, but I'll never forget the sound it made, or the cold terror I felt, knowing that magnificent, deadly predator was just beyond the thin walls of our tent, and the only thing standing between us and it was one very good dog. I have a friend, let's call him Kevin, who has always been drawn to the shadier side of making a buck. He's not a bad guy, just perpetually chasing some get-rich-quick scheme that usually involves cutting corners and operating in a legal grey area. He's tried everything from flipping questionable electronics online to promoting sketchy multi-level marketing products. So it wasn't a huge surprise when he told me about his latest venture, renting a house way out on the county line to host illegal poker games. The property was perfect for his purposes. It was a cheap, run-down rental on about 4 or 5 acres of land, isolated from prying eyes. If you stood on the front porch, you could see a tiny, ramshackle church with a tilting steeple about 1,000 yards down the road in one direction. In the other direction, maybe a quarter of a mile away, was a single-wide trailer with a yard full of rusting car parts, home to a guy we never saw but could occasionally hear blasting music. The most important feature, though, was the back of the property. It just melted directly into a large, dense patch of South Carolina woods, providing a natural barrier and a sense of total seclusion. Since gun ranges can be expensive and have a lot of rules, another friend of mine, Alex, and I were always looking for private land where we could go shooting. When we heard Kevin had rented this new place, we asked him if we could come out one weekend and put a few rounds through our pistols. He didn't care what we did as long as we weren't there on a game night, so he told us to have at it. The following Saturday, Alex and I drove out there. The paved road turned to gravel a mile before the house, and the driveway itself was just two dirt ruts leading up to a small vinyl-sided house that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. We found a good spot to set up our targets along the back edge of the mowed yard, right where the property started to get wild. It was a perfect setup. We had a solid backstop of thick trees and a wide open space to shoot from. We spent the first hour or so just having fun, shooting paper targets with our pistols, enjoying the freedom of not having a range master breathing down our necks. The sharp crack of the handguns echoed a bit, and then was swallowed by the thick woods behind us. After we'd gone through a few boxes of ammo, we decided to take a break and explore a little. We were curious to see how far back Kevin's property actually went. We left our gear near the house and started walking into the woods. The temperature dropped a few degrees as soon as we were under the tree canopy, and the air smelled damp and earthy. We walked down a small, gentle hill, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through low-hanging branches. After walking for a few minutes, we started seeing the markers, small fluorescent pink ribbons tied around tree trunks by surveyors. We followed them, realizing the property was a lot bigger than we had initially thought. By our estimation, we were already a good 150 or 200 yards deep into the woods, much further than it had looked from the house. We stopped for a moment, just talking about how much land Kevin had actually rented for his little poker operation. It was as we were standing there, in the relative quiet of the woods, that Alex noticed something. "What's that over there?" he asked, pointing off to our left. About 10 yards away, just on the other side of the pink-ribboned property line, was a patch of white on the forest floor that looked out of place against all the brown and green. It was an unnatural shape. Curious, we walked over to get a closer look. As we got nearer, the shape resolved itself into something recognizable, and a strange feeling started to creep into the back of my mind. It was an animal, a dead goat to be specific. It was lying on its side, its white fur matted with dirt and leaves. But the most unsettling thing was that it didn't have a head. Where its head should have been, there was just a clean, straight cut. It wasn't a jagged tear like a coyote or some other predator would have left. This was a slice, done by a human with a very sharp knife. It was bizarre and a little gross, but we tried to rationalize it. We were in the country. Maybe our redneck neighbor in the trailer butchered his own animals. Still, it was weird to just dump the body out here. As we were about to turn and walk away, I saw something else, a few yards further into the woods. It was the missing head, or at least I thought it was. We cautiously walked over to it. It was a goat's head, all right, but as soon as I saw it, my stomach turned. The fur on the head was coarse and black. The body we had just seen was from a white goat. This head belonged to a completely different animal. The creepiness of the situation immediately intensified. Who decapitates two different goats and leaves their parts scattered in the woods? Then we noticed another detail, one that was even more disturbing. We looked back at the headless white goat. The cut was high up on the neck, almost at the jawline. The black head lying on the ground, however, had been severed much lower down, with a long section of neck still attached, as if it had been hacked off closer to the shoulders. We stood there in silence for a moment, processing the sheer strangeness of the scene. We didn't bother looking for the rest of the black goat's body or the white goat's head. A cold, heavy realization was dawning on us. We noticed there were flies buzzing around, but the smell of decay wasn't overwhelming. The bodies hadn't been here long. There was no significant bloating or decomposition. This had happened very recently, almost certainly within the last day or two. The fun, casual atmosphere of our afternoon was completely gone, replaced by a sense of imminent dread. I've always been more afraid of what other people are capable of than any wild animal you might find in the woods. Bears and snakes act on instinct, but humans can be cruel and unpredictable for reasons you can't possibly understand. And we were standing in the middle of nowhere, at the scene of a bizarre, ritualistic-looking animal killing that had happened just hours before we arrived. The person who did this could still be nearby. They could be watching us right now. The fact that we were both armed offered a small sliver of comfort, but it didn't do much to calm the feeling of being somewhere we absolutely should not be. We didn't say another word. We just exchanged a look that said, "It's time to go," and immediately turned and walked back the way we came, much faster than we had walked in. We kept looking over our shoulders, our ears straining to hear any sound other than our own footsteps. When we broke through the tree line and back into the sunny yard, it felt like we had surfaced from deep, dark water. We packed up our gear in a hurry, threw it in the truck, and left. We never told Kevin the specifics of what we found. We just said the woods back there were creepy and left it at that. I tried to put the incident out of my mind, but it always lingered as a deeply unsettling memory. Then, about a year later, I was reading the local news and saw a story that made my blood run cold. The police had arrested a man in our area who was suspected of being a serial killer, responsible for the murders of several people over a few years. The article mentioned that his crimes had escalated over time and that before he moved on to human victims, he was known for torturing and killing animals. He was caught just a few miles from Kevin's rental house. I don't know for sure, of course, but I can't shake the horrifying thought that what Alex and I stumbled upon that day in the woods wasn't just some random act of country weirdness. It may have been the work of a man who was just getting started. My grandfather was a man who was more a part of the mountains than he was of the town where he lived. He passed away in the spring of 2005, and it left a hole in our family that felt as vast and empty as the valleys he loved to explore. He wasn't a man of many words, but he had a quiet strength, and his presence was a constant, steadying force in our lives. A few months after the funeral, with summer settling over the landscape, my grandmother decided she wanted to go back to his favorite spot one last time. It was a remote ridge on Blue Knob Mountain, a place he had taken her on one of their first dates, a place he returned to whenever he needed to think. It was a pilgrimage for her, a way to say a final, private goodbye. The whole family decided to go. There were 9 of us in total: my grandma, my parents, my aunt and uncle, my 2 older cousins, my older brother, David, and me. I was only 6 years old at the time, the youngest of the bunch by a long shot. We packed into 2 sturdy pickup trucks, a Ford and a Chevy, and began the long drive up the mountain. I remember the mood in the truck was quiet and heavy. The adults spoke in low, soft tones, sharing memories of my grandfather. I didn't fully grasp the finality of death yet, but I understood sadness, and I could feel it radiating from everyone around me. The paved road eventually gave way to a gravel track, and then the gravel track turned into a muddy, rutted-out dirt road that seemed to cling precariously to the side of the mountain. My dad was driving our truck, and I remember him gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the slick, treacherous turns. The trees grew thick and close on either side, their branches scraping against the windows. Finally, we reached a small, flat clearing where the road ended. This was as far as the trucks could go. We all got out and stretched our legs. The air up here was different, thin and cool, and smelling of pine and damp earth. My grandma stood for a moment, her hand resting on the hood of the truck, and just stared up at the peak. "It's another quarter-mile walk," she said, her voice a little shaky. "The trail starts just over there." The trail was more like a suggestion, a faint path worn into the mountainside by deer and the occasional hiker. The climb was steep, and I struggled to keep up. My little 6-year-old legs weren't built for this kind of terrain. David, who was 12 at the time and always looked out for me, stayed back, holding my hand and helping me over the bigger rocks and fallen logs. The rest of the family moved ahead, a silent procession making their way up the final ridge. They reached the top before we were even halfway there. They crested the ridge and then just stopped. One by one, they went completely still, forming a silent line against the bright blue sky. They just stood there, staring down at something on the other side. The murmur of their conversation had ceased. The silence was so sudden and absolute that even from down the trail, I could feel it. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet. David and I kept climbing, and I was getting whiny, complaining that they had left us behind and that I was tired. "What are they looking at?" I asked him, tugging on his sleeve. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the line of adults at the top of the ridge. He was starting to look nervous. As we got closer, I saw my dad take a step back, his hand going to his mouth. My aunt had her arm around my uncle, and my mum was just shaking her head slowly. My grandma was holding on to a small tree for support, her face pale. I was so focused on my own tired legs that I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get to the top and see what all the fuss was about. Finally, we were just a few feet from the crest. I could almost see over the top. I was about to take my final step when David suddenly broke the silence. "Hey," he said, his voice sounding tight. Before I could react, he swooped down, scooped me up into his arms, and turned me around so my back was to the view. He held me tight and started carrying me back down the trail. "No!" I yelled, kicking my legs. "I want to see. It's not fair. You never let me do anything fun." I was crying and whining, completely oblivious. Behind us, I could hear the clicking sounds of cameras. The adults were taking pictures of whatever was down there. David just kept walking, murmuring, "It's okay, it's just boring rocks. Nothing to see." He carried me all the way back down to the truck and sat me in the passenger seat. The rest of the family came trickling back down a few minutes later, their faces all grim and unsettled. The ride home was even quieter than the ride up. It was a tense, weird silence. I kept asking what they saw, and they kept giving me vague answers like, "It was just a strange rock slide," or "The view wasn't as nice as we remembered." They were clearly lying, and even at 6 years old, I knew it. I eventually forgot about that day, the memory buried under years of school and friendships and growing up. It wasn't until I was about 21, home from college for the holidays, that I found out what really happened. I was digging through an old box of photo albums in the attic, looking for pictures of my grandfather, when I found the album from that trip. I flipped through the pages, seeing the pictures of us in the trucks, the shots of the muddy road, and then I got to the pictures from the top of the mountain. They were blank, just completely black or washed out white rectangles. Every single one. I took the album downstairs and asked my mum about it. She sighed, a long, tired sound, and sat me down at the kitchen table. She finally told me the truth. When they had reached the top of that ridge, they had looked down upon a steep, grassy mountainside. But the entire slope was covered in enormous, perfectly black circles. She said they looked as if someone had taken a giant hole punch to the mountain. The grass inside the circles was gone, burned away down to the bare black earth. But the grass around the edges of each circle was perfectly green and untouched. There were dozens of them, all different sizes, from the size of a car to the size of a small house. She said they were so perfectly round, so unnaturally black, that it made her feel sick to her stomach. It felt wrong, like a violation of nature. My older brother, David, had seen the look on all their faces and knew that whatever it was, it would have terrified me. I was a sensitive kid with a lot of anxiety, and I was especially scared of things I couldn't understand, like natural disasters or unexplained phenomena. He had acted on pure instinct to protect me from it. The most unsettling part was the photos. Everyone's camera had been working perfectly fine that day. All the other pictures they took, of the family, of the trucks, of the trees, they all came out fine. But every single picture they took of those black circles on the mountain was either completely black or just a blank, overexposed white. It was as if the mountain, or whatever had made those marks, simply refused to be photographed. We still don't know what they were. My dad thinks it was some kind of fungal blight. My aunt is convinced it was aliens. My grandma, until the day she died, believed it was a sign from my grandfather. a message from the other side that she couldn't understand. All I know is that my brother saved me from seeing something that has haunted the rest of my family for years, and I am forever grateful for that. I live in a small town in northeastern Oklahoma where there isn't much to do. For me and my two best friends, Jesse and a guy we all called Rooster, our main source of entertainment was fishing. We'd been friends since middle school, bonded by a shared sense of boredom and a love for the outdoors. We knew every creek, river, and pond within a 50-mile radius. In the spring of 2012, we decided to try a new spot. It was an old, decommissioned primitive camping area called Sparrowhawk Point. It wasn't exactly a secret, but it was far enough off the beaten path that most people didn't bother with it. The Park Service had stopped maintaining it years ago, so the roads were rough and the campsites were overgrown, which is exactly why we liked it. It meant we would have the place to ourselves. We loaded up Rooster's old beat-up Ford Ranger around 11 at night. We threw our fishing gear in the back, along with a cooler full of cheap beer and some snacks. The mood was light. We were blasting old country music on the crappy speakers and joking about who was going to catch the biggest fish. The drive out there took us down a series of progressively smaller and more neglected roads until we were on a single-lane dirt track winding through the dense woods. As we were nearing the turnoff for the main camping loop, a pair of headlights appeared up ahead. A dark-colored sedan was slowly pulling out of the entrance, its tires crunching on the gravel. It seemed odd to see another car leaving so late at night. We slowed down as we passed them. I tried to get a look at the driver, but the windows were tinted and I couldn't see a thing. The car just looked out of place. It was too clean, too new for a place like this. Jesse made a comment about how he thought we'd be the only ones out here, and we all kind of shrugged it off, but a little seed of unease had been planted. We pulled into the main clearing and picked our usual spot by the water. We got our gear out, cracked open a few beers, and started setting up our lines. But the light-hearted mood from the truck was gone. The woods felt different tonight. Usually, this place was alive with the sounds of crickets, frogs, and the rustling of small animals. But tonight, it was silent. A dead, heavy silence that felt like it was pressing in on us from all sides. We tried to ignore it, making small talk and focusing on our fishing, but the feeling that something was wrong just kept growing. It felt like we were being watched. I'm usually the one who can stay out all night, no problem, but after about an hour of sitting in that oppressive silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The hair on the back of my neck was standing on end, and my stomach was in knots. "Guys," I said, my voice sounding a little too loud in the quiet. "I don't know about you, but I've got a really bad feeling about this place tonight. I think we should leave." I expected them to give me a hard time, to call me a wimp, but Rooster just nodded slowly. "Yeah, man, I feel it too." Jesse had already started reeling in his line. The relief in the truck was palpable as we loaded up our gear and got the hell out of there. Rooster was driving slowly as we made our way back through the old, overgrown campground loop. He had his brights on, cutting a path through the darkness. That's when we saw it. In a small, secluded campsite that we knew no one ever used, there was the faint orange glow of dying embers in a fire pit. Rooster stopped the truck without a word, a silent agreement passing between us. He got out and walked cautiously towards the fire pit. A moment later, he motioned for us to come and look. His face was pale in the moonlight. We walked over, and what we saw turned my blood to ice. Lying in the ashes of the small fire were the charred remains of 3 small wooden crosses. They were maybe a foot tall each, crudely made but unmistakably crosses. And they were resting on a patch of freshly turned earth, a perfect rectangle about the size of a human grave. The soil was dark and loose, completely different from the hard, packed dirt around it. It looked like something had been dug up or buried just hours before. We didn't say a word. We just turned and ran back to the truck. The panic was real now. We scrambled inside and Rooster slammed the truck into gear, spitting gravel as he sped away. All I could think about was getting back to the main road, back to civilization. We were almost to the exit of the campground when my headlights swept across something parked on the shoulder of the road, tucked back in the trees. It was the same dark-colored sedan we had seen on our way in. The windows were still tinted, and we couldn't see if anyone was inside, but we knew they hadn't left. They had just pulled over, turned off their lights, and waited. They had doubled back, and they had probably been in the woods the whole time, watching us, waiting for us to leave, or maybe waiting for us to find what they had left behind. We blew past them and didn't slow down until we were back on the paved highway, the comforting glow of a distant streetlight in our rearview mirror. We never went back to Sparrowhawk Point again. For a few summers during college, I worked as a wilderness guide for a big Girl Scout camp up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. My job was to take small groups of older girls on multi-day backpacking trips, teaching them things like map and compass navigation, how to filter water, and basic survival skills. I loved the job. It was challenging, and it was rewarding to see these kids gain confidence in the outdoors. For this particular trip, I was assigned a group of about 8 girls, all around 14 years old. I was also assigned 2 other adult staff members, Sarah and Jessica, who were supposed to be the group's regular camp counselors. Their job was to manage the kids' behavior, help with morale, and generally be the fun adults, while I handled all the technical wilderness stuff. The first day went smoothly. We hiked about 5 miles in and found a beautiful, secluded spot next to a creek to make our camp. The girls were excited, full of energy, and eager to learn. I showed them how to properly choose a campsite, how to set up their tents to be weather resistant, and how to store their food safely away from bears. After everything was set up, I pulled the other 2 counselors aside. "All right," I said. "I need to go find a spot to dig a latrine. It'll probably take me about 20 minutes. Can you 2 keep an eye on the girls while I'm gone?" They both nodded, smiling. "No problem," Sarah said, pulling a copy of a celebrity magazine out of her backpack. I grabbed my small shovel and a roll of toilet paper and walked a good distance away from the camp, following the proper leave no trace protocols. I found a suitable spot, dug my hole, and was in the middle of my business when the sound of gunshots echoed through the valley. It sounded like a high-powered rifle, and it was close. My first thought was for the girls. I knew they would be scared, but my second thought was that Sarah and Jessica were with them. They were trained camp counselors. They would know how to keep the kids calm and safe. I trusted them to do their jobs. I finished up, carefully buried everything, and hiked back to the campsite as quickly as I could. I arrived about 5 minutes after the gunshots, and I walked into a scene of complete and utter chaos. The girls were in a full-blown panic. One of them, a particularly take-charge kind of kid named Emily, had apparently decided that they were under attack by snipers and had ordered everyone to change into camouflage-coloured clothing. A few of the girls had actually done it and were now trying to hide behind trees. The other girls were crying, asking me if we were all going to die. It was a mess, but the most confusing and infuriating part was that Sarah and Jessica were nowhere to be seen. "Where are the other counselors?" I asked Emily, trying to keep my voice calm. She just shrugged, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. They went in their tent." I felt a surge of anger. I got the girls calmed down first. I gathered them all together and explained that we were in a national forest and that it was hunting season. I told them that the hunters were not aiming at us and that we were perfectly safe. I explained that if they really wanted to change clothes for safety, bright colours were actually the best choice, so hunters could easily see them and avoid them. It took a while, but eventually their breathing slowed down and the crying stopped. Once the kids were settled, I stormed over to the tent that Sarah and Jessica had pitched, a good 50 yards away from the girls' tents, tucked back in the trees. I unzipped the flap without knocking. They were both in there, lying on their sleeping bags, reading their magazines. They had also packed a book of fun quizzes and were in the middle of one. They looked up at me, annoyed by the interruption. "What the hell are you 2 doing?" I demanded, my voice low and shaking with rage. "Didn't you hear the gunshots? The girls were having a complete meltdown." Sarah just shrugged, not even sitting up. "We assumed you were taking care of it." "I told you I was leaving to go crap in the woods," I hissed. "You 2 were responsible for the kids while I was gone. Why didn't you go check on them?" Jessica finally chimed in, a bored look on her face. "We thought you'd come back. We were taking our break. I was so stunned by their incompetence and sheer lack of concern that I was speechless for a moment. I just zipped up their tent and walked away. I spent the rest of the evening dealing with the fallout, reassuring the girls and trying to get the trip back on track. Later that evening, while I was down at the creek refilling our water bottles, I ran into the hunters. It was a father and son, and they were very apologetic. I explained where our camp was, and they promised to hunt in a different part of the valley. They were perfectly reasonable people, not the madmen the girls had imagined. When we got back to the main camp at the end of the trip, I filed a full detailed report with my supervisor. Sarah and Jessica were, to put it mildly, reprimanded. They were never allowed to lead a backpacking group again, and they were certainly never placed on a staff team together again. The girls, thankfully, still managed to have a good time on the rest of the trip, but I will never forget the image of those two counselors relaxing in their tent while the children they were responsible for were in a state of terror just a few yards away. It was the most unprofessional and dangerous behavior I had ever witnessed. I live in a small, quiet town in the southwest of Sweden. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and nothing much ever happens. Last week, on a Tuesday afternoon, I was feeling bored, so I called up my friend, Anya. We both have mopeds, which are our main form of transportation and our ticket to freedom. We decided to go for a ride and maybe find a nice spot to hang out and eat some snacks. We met up at the local grocery store, bought some chips and soda, and then headed out of town. I had been to this beautiful sheep pasture once before, a few months ago, and I wanted to show it to Anya. It's about a 15-minute ride from the centre of town, down a series of winding country roads. Eventually, the paved road turns into a narrow, single-lane track surrounded by a thick, dark forest. It's a road that is rarely used. I've only ever seen 1 or 2 cars on it in all the times I've been down it. Because of this, I was driving pretty carelessly, weaving back and forth across the centre line, just enjoying the ride. At one point, I glanced in my rearview mirror to check on Anya. I saw that she was driving way over on the far right side of the road, dangerously close to the deep ditch that ran alongside it. My first thought was that she was trying to be funny, to make a point that I should be staying on my side of the road. But then she veered even further to the right, and her front tire dipped into the ditch. She wobbled for a second, almost losing control, before she managed to pull the moped back onto the road. I stopped and waited for her to catch up. We were both laughing about it. "What happened back there?" I asked her. "You almost took a dive." She was still laughing as she answered. "I don't know," she said. "I got distracted by something weird on one of the trees, and I just forgot to turn with the curve in the road." We laughed about it for a bit longer and then continued on our way to the pasture. We spent about an hour at the sheep pasture, sitting on a big flat rock, eating our snacks and talking. The sun was warm and the sheep were grazing peacefully. It was a perfect afternoon. For some reason, the conversation came back to her near accident on the road. "So what was it that you saw on that tree?" I asked her, curious now. What could have been so distracting? She got a strange look on her face. "It was some kind of wooden plank," she said slowly. "It was nailed to a tree, and it was carved to look like a person. A stick figure almost, but it had a round head with just 2 holes drilled in it for eyes." I just stared at her. "What the hell?" I said. "That's really disturbing." She nodded. Yeah, it was kind of creepy. A morbid curiosity got the better of us. On our way home, we decided we had to find it again. We drove slowly down that same narrow forest road, scanning the trees on the right-hand side. We stopped our mopeds by the side of the road, and I killed my engine. The sudden silence of the forest was almost deafening. As I looked up, I spotted it immediately. And it was even creepier than she had described. It was a rough, weathered piece of wood, about 3 feet tall, nailed to a large pine tree about 20 feet back from the road. It was shaped like a crude human figure with a thin body, 2 stick-like arms, and a round head. But the head was what got me. There were just 2 dark, empty holes where the eyes should have been. They seemed to stare out from the tree, and the whole thing just looked so dead and out of place. It gave me a powerful, visceral feeling of dread. I took out my phone and snapped a picture of it. As I was looking at it on my screen, my mind started racing. I thought about cults, about murderers leaving some kind of twisted calling card, about strange rituals happening in these woods. It felt like a warning, a sign that we were trespassing in a place where we were not welcome. I didn't want to be there anymore. "Let's go," I said to Anya, and we got back on our mopeds and drove away, much faster this time. I don't think I'll be going back to that pasture again. I still have the picture on my phone, and every time I look at it, I get the same cold, creepy feeling. I don't know what that figure was, or who put it there, but it didn't feel right. It felt like a dark secret that the forest was keeping. My family owns a fairly large piece of property that has been in our family for generations. It's an old farm, and the land has a lot of history. My great-grandfather bought it from an old couple who had let it go after a tornado ripped through the area in the 1950s. The storm had destroyed most of the original buildings: 2 large barns, a silo, and several smaller sheds. Over the years, my family has worked hard to bring the farm back to life, but we only ever managed to rebuild one of the barns. The other one remains a collapsed, skeletal ruin of rotting timbers. There's an old shed near the barns, its door long since blown off, leaving a dark, gaping maw that always looks like it's watching you. The silo also toppled in the storm, and its long metal tube now lies rusting in the grass next to the shed. All of these dilapidated structures stand along the path I have to take to get to my favourite deer stand, which is located in the furthest field at the very back of our property. This particular story happened when I was a freshman in college, home for Thanksgiving break in 2011. I had gone out for an afternoon hunt and stayed in the stand until the last light had faded from the sky. It was a cold, clear night, and the stars were brilliant. I climbed down from the stand and began the long, quiet walk back to the house. I've always had an eerie feeling when I walk past those old, torn-down buildings, even in the daylight. But at night, the feeling is 100 times worse. The collapsed barn looks like the ribcage of some giant dead animal, and the dark opening of the shed feels like an entrance to another world. There's also an old, stone-lined well near the barns, covered by a heavy concrete slab. The slab has a crack in it, and a large chunk of the concrete siding has broken away, leaving a dark, mysterious hole. That well has always given me the creeps. As I was walking past the well and the barns that night, the world was completely silent. There was no wind, no crickets, just the sound of my own boots on the frozen ground. I was about halfway across the field when a sound made me freeze. It was the distinct sound of a metal chain whipping through the air, followed by a faint, giddy laughter. My head snapped up, and I looked towards the fence line that runs along the edge of the field, near the old shed. What I saw made my heart stop. 2 men were running alongside the fence, moving away from me. They were dressed in old-fashioned black and white striped prison uniforms. Both of them were laughing, a high-pitched, unhinged sound that echoed across the silent field. And they both had heavy chains on their wrists and ankles, the chains swinging and clanking as they ran with a strange, galloping gait. My hunting instincts kicked in, but they were scrambled by pure terror. I dropped to one knee in the middle of the field and fumbled to load a shell into my shotgun. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few seconds. I raised the gun to my shoulder and looked through the scope, trying to get a bead on them, but they were moving fast. This was the largest field on our property, and they had a good 100-yard head start on me before they would reach the dark tree line at the edge of the woods. And then, just like that, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stayed there, kneeling in the cold dirt for at least 10 minutes, my shotgun trained on the spot where I had last seen them. I scanned the entire tree line, waiting for them to reappear, waiting for any sound or movement, but there was nothing, just the same dead silence as before. Eventually, the adrenaline started to fade, and my rational mind tried to take over. I told myself I was just tired. I had woken up at 4 in the morning for the morning hunt and had been out all day. I was probably just sleep-deprived and hallucinating. It had to be a trick of the moonlight, my overactive imagination filling in the blanks. I tried to convince myself of that as I stood up on shaky legs and continued my walk back to the house, my shotgun held tightly in my hands. But I couldn't shake the image of those two laughing men in their striped suits or the sound of their chains. I've never told anyone in my family what I saw that night. I don't know if I saw ghosts or if my mind just played a cruel trick on me, but I've never hunted in that backfield at night again. Every summer, without fail, my family would pack up the car and drive 3 hours north to a small, quiet lake where we rented the same cabin for a week. It was a tradition that started when I was just a baby and continued all the way through my teenage years. As my brother Mark and I got older, our adventures on the lake became more daring. We graduated from building sandcastles to exploring the lake in our kayaks. Our favorite spot was a rock formation on the far side of the lake that all the locals called the cliffs. It wasn't a massive cliff, maybe only 15 or 20 feet at its highest point, but to us, it was a thrilling challenge. The water below was incredibly deep and clear. We spent countless summer afternoons there, jumping off the rocks into the cool, dark water. As we got into our later teens, we would make a game out of it, trying to see who could touch the bottom. But no matter how deep we dived, we could never reach it. The lake just seemed to go on forever. This particular incident happened the summer I was 17, so Mark would have been 19. It was a hot, lazy afternoon, and we had decided to take our kayaks out to the cliffs on our own, without the rest of our family. We spent a good hour jumping off the rocks, trying to outdo each other with flips and cannonballs. Eventually, we got too cold and decided to take a break. We climbed up onto the flat top of the cliffs and stretched out on the warm rock to dry off in the sun. We were just lying there, not saying much, just listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the rocks, when Mark sat up. "Hey, what's that?" he said, pointing down into the water. I sat up and looked where he was pointing. About 10 feet out from the base of the cliff, a white shape was slowly floating up from the depths. It was hard to make out at first, but as it got closer to the surface, we could see what it was. It was a large, perfectly formed letter, H. It looked like it was made of some kind of styrofoam or plastic. It bobbed on the surface for a few seconds, and then, just as strangely as it had appeared, it tilted and sank back down into the dark water, disappearing from sight. We just stared at the spot where it had been, completely baffled. "That was weird," I said. Before Mark could even reply, another shape appeared in the same spot, floating up from below. This time, it was the letter E. It followed the same pattern, surfacing for a moment before sinking back into the depths. We were both on our feet now, staring intently at the water. It was soon followed by 2 more letters, one right after the other. First, an L, and then a P. The 4 letters had spelled out the word help. A cold chill ran down my spine, despite the heat of the sun. We didn't jump back in the water after that. We didn't say a word to each other. We just scrambled down from the cliffs, got into our kayaks, and paddled back to our cabin as fast as we could. The fun, carefree feeling of the afternoon was gone, replaced by a sense of dread and 1,000 unanswered questions. We never mentioned what we saw to anyone, not even our parents. I think we were both afraid that no one would believe us, or that they would think we were just making it up. As the years went by, I pushed the memory to the back of my mind, and I think I eventually convinced myself that it hadn't really happened, that it was just a strange dream, or a trick of the light. It wasn't until about 10 years later that the memory came flooding back. I was working as a counselor at a summer camp, and we were all sitting around a campfire telling ghost stories. I decided to tell the story of the letters in the water, embellishing it a bit to make it scarier for the kids. As I was telling it, I started to wonder if I'd just made the whole thing up over the years. That night, I sent a text to my brother, Mark. I wrote, "Hey, weird question. Do you remember that one time we went kayaking out to the cliffs by ourselves and saw something weird in the water?" A few minutes later, he replied, "Yeah, I remember." I texted back, "What was it that we saw? I'm trying to remember." His reply came back almost instantly, and it sent a shiver down my spine all over again. He just wrote, the letters spelled help. A couple of years ago, I was dating a woman named Claire. She was an amazing person, but she was a city girl through and through. I, on the other hand, had grown up camping and hiking, and I really wanted to share that part of my life with her. I decided to plan a weekend camping trip for us, a sort of Camping 101 experience. I picked a spot that I knew was beautiful, but also very isolated. I wanted it to be just the two of us, away from the noise and distractions of the city, where we could just connect with nature and with each other. We drove out on a Friday afternoon, and the first 2 days of the trip were perfect. Claire was a natural. She loved the fresh air, the quiet, and the feeling of being so far away from everything. We spent our days exploring the woods, and on the second day, we found this incredible, hidden waterfall that I was pretty sure very few people had ever seen. We spent the rest of our time just relaxing by the fire, reading our books, and talking. It was exactly what I had hoped for. On our last night, we were both tired from a long day of hiking. We went to bed early, snuggled up in our sleeping bags inside our 2-person tent. In the middle of the night, I was woken up by a strange sound. It was a sharp, distinct knocking sound, like someone was rapping their knuckles against a tree. I lay there for a moment, listening. I slowly turned my head and saw that Claire was fast asleep, breathing softly in her sleeping bag. I told myself it was probably just a woodpecker or a falling branch and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard another sound. This one was much closer. It was a light, scratching sound right on the side of our tent. It was a very specific, unmistakable sound, like fingernails being dragged slowly down the nylon fabric, from the top of the tent all the way to the bottom. My heart started pounding in my chest. I wanted to call out, to wake Claire up, but I was completely frozen with fear. Someone was right outside our tent. And then I heard a whisper. It was a dry, breathy female voice, and it was so close that it felt like the person was right next to my ear. It just said 2 words. Hello, dear. I have never been so terrified in my entire life. It was a primal, gut-wrenching fear. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, my eyes squeezed shut, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or 2, I didn't hear anything else. The silence was almost as terrifying as the whisper had been. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, my hands shaking. I had to know what was out there. I crept to the door of the tent and slowly, quietly, unzipped it just a crack. It was a full moon that night, so the clearing around our tent was bathed in a pale, silvery light. I peeked my head out and looked around. There was no one there. Our campfire was just a pile of glowing embers. The woods were still and silent. The most unsettling part was that I hadn't heard a single sound of someone walking away. No footsteps, no breaking twigs, no rustling leaves. The ground around our tent was covered in dry leaves and pine needles. It would have been impossible for someone to leave without making any noise. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there had simply vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring out of the tent, until the first rays of dawn started to light up the sky. As soon as it was light enough to see, I woke Claire up, and we packed up our camp and left, hours earlier than we had planned. I never told her what happened. I didn't want to scare her and ruin the memory of what had otherwise been a perfect trip. But I still hear that voice in my nightmares sometimes. Hello, dear. I used to be an avid camper. I would go out almost every other weekend with my 2 best friends, Mike and Tom. We had our routine down to a science. We'd find a good spot, set up camp, and then spend our nights just hanging out by the fire, talking and enjoying the peace and quiet of the woods. This one night, however, was anything but peaceful. We were camping in a state forest that we had been to many times before. It was a late autumn night, and the air was crisp and cold. There was a nearly full moon, and it was so bright that it cast long, sharp shadows across the field next to our campsite. It was almost like daytime, but a strange, washed-out version of it. We had let the fire die down to embers and were just lying on our backs in the middle of the field, looking up at the stars. That's when I first heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just one of my friends messing with me, or maybe someone from one of the other campsites further down the road. But the sound wasn't coming from the direction of the camp. It was coming from the opposite direction, from the dark woods at the far end of the field. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, sitting up. Mike and Tom both sat up too, their faces tense. We all went silent, straining to listen. The whisper came again, a little clearer this time. It was a strange, high-pitched sound. We couldn't make out any words, but it was definitely a voice. A sense of morbid curiosity took over. We got up and started walking across the field, away from the safety of our campsite, towards the source of the sound. The whisper seemed to grow a little louder with every step we took, but it was still just a faint, ethereal sound. We reached the edge of the field and came to a narrow paved road. Across the road was a fenced-in area. It was just an old, rusty wire fence, the kind you see on old farms, and it was so dilapidated that it was easy to step over. On the other side of the fence was a small, dark patch of woods. The trees were mostly tall, thin pines, and they were spaced pretty far apart from each other. But even with the bright moonlight, it was completely pitch black inside that small forest. It was like the light couldn't penetrate past the first few rows of trees. It was an unnatural, oppressive darkness. And now the voice was much louder. It was no longer a faint whisper. It was a clear, distinct voice, but it was still being spoken in a whisper, and it was the voice of a little girl. "Come play," it said. The words hung in the cold night air, sending a shiver down my spine. There were no women on our camping trip, and there were certainly no little girls. We were miles from the nearest town. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and the voice of a child was calling out to us from the pitch-black woods, asking us to come and play. We just stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. The voice called out again, "Come play with us." Us. There was more than one. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned around and ran. We didn't stop running until we were back at our campsite, frantically throwing our gear into our bags. We didn't even bother to pack up the tent. We just left it there, got in our car, and drove away as fast as we could. We never went back to that campsite, and to this day, I can still hear that little girl's voice in my head. "Come play." I live on a small 5-acre hobby farm that's kind of in between worlds. It's not the suburbs, but it's not the deep, isolated woods either. My property is nestled amongst a bunch of other small farms and homesteads, a patchwork of fields and houses. It's the kind of place where you know your neighbors, but you still have enough space to feel like you have your own little piece of the world. Last year, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, that sense of peace was shattered. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking a cup of coffee and looking out the window at my small herd of goats grazing peacefully in the pasture. That's when I heard it. A huge, booming gunshot that was way too close for comfort. My first thought was that it was just a car backfiring on the road that runs alongside my property. But then it happened again. A second, deafening blast that made the windows rattle. I jumped up from the table and ran to the back door. I could see a dark green pickup truck pulled over on the side of the road, just past my hedge line. A man was standing in the bed of the truck, and he had a very large rifle with a scope on it. He was pointing it directly into my pasture, at my goats. One of my goats, a slim brown doe named Daisy, looks a little bit like a deer if you're not paying attention. But this guy was less than 100 yards away. There was no way he could have mistaken my pasture, with its fences and my house clearly visible in the background, for the wilderness. And besides, there are houses and other farms all around us. It was an incredibly reckless and dangerous thing to do. A wave of hot anger washed over me. Part of me wanted to march right over there and scream at him, to rip him a new one for endangering my animals and my family. But another, more rational part of me took over. This was a man with a high-powered rifle who was clearly not making good decisions. I didn't want to end up as a tragic headline on the local news. Local farmer shot in dispute with hunter, So, instead of confronting him, I decided to try and get a better look at him, maybe get his license plate number. I started to sneak along the side of my house, using the hedge for cover, but before I could get a clear look, he lowered his rifle, got back into the cab of his truck, and sped away, his tires spitting gravel. Just as he was driving off, my neighbor from across the road came running over. He was pale and shaking. He had been outside, working in his garden, when the shooting started. He told me he had to duck behind a large oak tree in his yard to avoid being hit. One of the bullets had whizzed right past his head. We called the police, and a deputy came out to take our report. But we hadn't been able to get a license plate number, and the description of the man and his truck was too generic. There was nothing they could do. I spent the rest of the day checking on my goats, my heart pounding every time I thought about how close they, and my neighbor, had come to being seriously hurt or killed. It was a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous animals you can encounter are not the ones with 4 legs, but the ones with 2. The spring turkey hunting trip was more than just a trip. It was a fixture in our lives, as reliable as the changing of the seasons. For 7 years, ever since I was old enough to be trusted with a shotgun and not trip over my own feet, I had joined my dad, his best friend Frank, and Frank's father-in-law George. For them, the traditions stretched back decades, a sacred pilgrimage into the greening mountains of early spring. It was a time to disconnect from jobs and responsibilities and reconnect with something older and quieter. This year was the first one I'd missed. The rigid structure of military basic training didn't allow for exceptions, not even for sacred family traditions. The story I'm about to tell took place a couple of years before that, on my 3rd trip, when I was 19 and thought I knew a thing or two about the world. Our spot was always the same. It wasn't a designated campsite with numbered posts and metal fire rings. It was just a clearing, a patch of flattish ground carved out of the woods, over years of use by people like us, right next to the white-blazed path of the Appalachian Trail. It was primitive, which was exactly how we liked it. The location meant we occasionally saw thru-hikers, their gaunt faces and lean frames, a testament to the thousands of miles they were walking. We always treated them with a kind of reverence. They were undertaking a journey we could only dream of. We'd offer a hot cup of coffee, a cold beer, or a place by the fire for an hour. It was part of the unwritten code of the trail. On this particular trip, the turkeys had been stubbornly silent. After a few fruitless mornings spent sitting motionlessly in the cold, pre-dawn woods, my dad and I decided to change tactics for the afternoon. We grabbed our fishing rods and headed for a small creek we knew, a couple of miles from camp. We left Frank and George behind to hold down the fort, probably napping in their camp chairs by the smoky fire. We spent a few hours by the water, not catching much but enjoying the peace of it. The sound of the creek bubbling over the rocks was a good substitute for the gobbles of turkeys we weren't hearing. When the sun started to dip below the ridge, we packed up our gear and headed back. As we got closer to camp, we could smell the wood smoke and hear the low murmur of voices. It wasn't just Frank and George. There was a third voice, one we didn't recognize. Walking into the clearing, we saw him. A man was sitting on one of our log stumps, nursing a can of beer we'd left in the cooler. He was scruffy, with a thin, wiry build that spoke of lean times. His hair was a tangled mess, and his eyes, set deep in a weathered face, looked tired beyond his years. He was probably in his late 30s. My first thought was that he was just another hiker, a friendly traveller who had stopped for a rest. Frank and George were chatting with him, so it all seemed perfectly normal. I nodded a hello and sat down by the fire, the warmth feeling good on my face after the cooler air down by the creek. My dad told Frank he was going to grab some more firewood before it got properly dark, and Frank decided to go with him. That left me, George, and the new guy. George was a man of few words, always had been, so he just sat there, whittling a piece of wood with his pocket knife, a habit of his. That meant it was up to me to make conversation. The man was friendly enough, but his friendliness had a strange edge to it. He asked a lot of questions, not the usual hiker small talk about mileage or trail conditions. His questions were more specific, more focused on us. He asked what kind of gear we had, how good our tents were against the cold. what kind of food we'd packed. He wanted to know exactly how long we planned on staying. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interview, like he was gathering information. Then came the oddest question. He looked around our small, established camp, our 2 tents, the fire pit, the cooler, the chairs, and asked if he could set up his camp right there with us for the night. We were a tight group. This annual trip was our time, and we weren't really looking to add a stranger to the mix, especially for an overnight stay. It just wasn't our style. Frank, who had just returned with my dad, overheard the request. He handled it politely. He told the man that we just didn't have the space, that our site was pretty full as it was. It was a gentle rejection. The man seemed a bit put out. A flicker of something like disappointment, or maybe annoyance crossed his face, but he didn't argue. He just shrugged, said he'd find a spot a little further down the trail, finished his beer, and left, melting back into the darkening woods. The second he was out of sight, the entire mood of the camp shifted. The easygoing, relaxed atmosphere we'd cultivated for days vanished in an instant. My dad and Frank exchanged a look, a silent communication that I didn't understand, but that clearly conveyed a shared sense of alarm. "Did he tell you his story?" Frank asked my dad in a low voice. My dad shook his head. Without another word, Frank walked over to our tents. He unzipped the door to his, pulled out his 12-gauge shotgun, and then did the same with my dad's and my own. He came back to the fire with all 3 guns. He tossed a box of shells to my dad and kept one for himself. Then they began to load them. The sound of the shells being chambered, that heavy, mechanical shuck-shuck, was a sound I had only ever heard in the woods while actively hunting. Never in camp, not once. My dad handed me my loaded shotgun. "Just sit here and keep your eyes open," he said. His voice was calm, but his face was set like stone. He then walked to the edge of the clearing, holding his phone up in the air, trying to find a single bar of service to call the state troopers. I was completely lost. My heart was starting to hammer against my ribs. I sat there, the cold, heavy steel of the shotgun resting in my lap, trying to piece together what was happening. This wasn't a joke. The gravity on their faces was real. Finally, while my dad was still trying to get a signal, Frank looked over at me and George and told us what had happened while we were gone. The hiker had wandered into camp about an hour after we'd left. At first, he'd been charming, but the conversation quickly took a strange turn. He told them he was hiking the whole Appalachian Trail, all the way to New England. But when they looked at his gear, it made no sense. He had a small, flimsy day pack that looked like something a kid would take to school. It was mostly flat, clearly holding next to nothing. No sleeping bag, no tent, no visible food supply. When Frank, trying to be friendly, asked him if he carried a gun or anything for protection against bears or other animals, the man's eyes had gotten shifty. He started to answer, then trailed off and changed the subject without ever giving a real response. Then, he had just volunteered it. As if it was something to be proud of, he told Frank and George that he was a wanted man. He claimed he had killed someone in another state and was now on the run, heading north to disappear. He said it with a chilling casualness, like he was talking about the weather. Frank and George had just sat there, frozen, trying to act normal, trying not to show the fear that was flooding their veins. Just before my dad and I had walked back into the clearing, the man had stood up, announced that he needed to change his clothes, and without any warning had dropped his pants right there in the middle of our camp, standing in front of them in nothing but his underwear. That was the moment they knew. It wasn't just a strange guy with a tall tale. The casual admission of murder, the lack of gear, the bizarre and unpredictable behavior, it all added up to a situation that was spiraling out of control. They were miles from help, alone in the woods, with a man who was either dangerously insane, a violent fugitive, or both. In the more than 25 years they had been making this trip, not once had they ever felt the need to have a loaded gun in the campsite. Tonight they had 3. Eventually, my dad got a spotty signal and managed to get through to the state troopers. It took them over an hour to arrive, their headlights cutting through the darkness of the forest road. We gave our statements, describing the man and retelling the story he had told us. They took it seriously, but by then, he was long gone. They searched the nearby area, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a mountain range. He was just another ghost on the trail. We never saw him again. We packed up and left the next morning. The trip cut short. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt menacing, full of dark possibilities. The memory of that man's tired eyes and the casual, almost boastful way he confessed to murder is something that has stayed with me ever since. I can count the number of times I've been camping on one finger, and I plan to keep it that way for the rest of my life. The single experience I had was more than enough. It was during high school, a time when my friends and I were fueled by a potent combination of youthful arrogance and profound stupidity. We thought we were invincible, and the idea of a camping trip seemed like the ultimate expression of our newfound freedom. We decided we would take our E&O hammocks, which were the trendy new thing at the time, to a nearby state park and spend a night sleeping in the open air. We arrived at the park on a warm, late spring afternoon. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. We found a spot in the main campground that seemed perfect, a cluster of tall, sturdy-looking trees that would be ideal for hanging our 6 hammocks. We went about setting up our temporary home with a sense of self-satisfied competence, feeling like seasoned outdoorsmen. We got a fire going in the metal ring, clumsily roasted some hot dogs on sticks until they were blackened on the outside and still cold in the middle, and followed them up with s'mores. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, feeling incredibly cool and grown up. Around 10 o'clock, the fire had died down to embers and we were all starting to yawn. We climbed into our respective hammocks, cocooning ourselves in the thin nylon. I remember looking up through the canopy of leaves at the stars, feeling a sense of deep peace. It was a perfect night. Of course, being the irresponsible teenagers that we were, not a single one of us had thought to check the weather forecast. An hour or so later, I was ripped from sleep by a flash of light so brilliant it seemed to sear through my closed eyelids. It was followed, without any delay, by a crack of thunder so loud and violent that it felt like the world was splitting in two. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with the force of it. A second later, the sky opened up. This wasn't just rain, it was a deluge. It was as if someone had overturned an ocean directly on top of us. We all yelled in shock and confusion, scrambling out of our hammocks. Within seconds, we were soaked to the bone, our clothes plastered to our skin. The rain was coming down so hard it was difficult to see. We made a frantic, disorganized dash for the only shelter we had, my small sedan, parked at the edge of the campsite. All 6 of us, dripping and shivering, piled into the car, fogging up the windows almost immediately. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably about an hour, watching the storm unleash its fury on the world outside. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the rain hammered against the car's roof in a deafening, relentless rhythm. Lightning lit up the campground in stark, terrifying flashes, revealing trees bending at impossible angles. Eventually, the violence of the storm began to subside. The thunder moved further away, and the torrential downpour eased into a steady, almost gentle drizzle. We were cold and miserable, but our determination to see our trip through hadn't been entirely washed away. We decided to get out and try to rehang our sopping wet hammocks. I was the first one to open a car door and step out into the damp, charged air. I hadn't taken more than 2 steps away from the car when a sound ripped through the night. It started as a loud, sickening crack, the sound of something ancient and massive giving way. It was immediately followed by a tremendous, echoing crash that seemed to shake the entire forest. It was a sound of immense weight and finality. My immediate reaction was pure fear. I jumped back into the car and slammed the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends, however, were either braver or dumber than me. Their curiosity outweighed their fear. They wanted to go see what had made the noise. I argued against it, but I was outvoted. After a minute of debate, we all agreed to go investigate, a decision that still seems foolish to me. We grabbed our flashlights from the glove compartments, their beams cutting weak circles in the misty darkness. We We started walking down the paved loop of the campground road, heading in the general direction of the crash. The air smelled of rain, wet pine, and freshly broken wood. We walked for maybe 500 yards, our sneakers squelching on the wet asphalt. And then, our flashlight beams fell on it. An enormous oak tree, one of the oldest and biggest in the whole campground, lay across the road. It had been struck by lightning, a massive, jagged scar running down its trunk. The tree hadn't just fallen, it had come down with cataclysmic force, right on top of a beautiful vintage Airstream trailer that was parked in one of the campsites. The shiny silver trailer was crushed in the middle, bent into a V shape under the unbelievable weight of the tree trunk. Standing beside the wreckage were a man and a woman, probably in their 60s, huddled together with two small, trembling dogs. They were just staring at their destroyed trailer, their faces pale and blank with shock. The woman was shaking uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. As we approached, she looked at us with wide, unfocused eyes and started talking, her voice thin and reedy. She told us they had been asleep inside when it happened. The main trunk of the massive oak tree, a piece of wood easily 4 feet in diameter, had crashed through the roof and landed just 2 feet from where her head had been resting on her pillow. 2 feet. If the lightning had struck a slightly different spot, if the tree had fallen at a slightly different angle, she would have been crushed instantly. The thought was so horrifying it was hard to process. We didn't know what to do, but we knew we had to do something. We used one of our cell phones to call the park ranger. He sounded annoyed and sleepy on the phone, clearly reluctant to come out in the middle of a stormy night. But when we explained what had happened, he agreed to come. He finally showed up about 30 minutes later in his official truck. He took one long look at the crushed Airstream, the massive tree, and the shell-shocked couple, and his demeanor changed from annoyed to deeply concerned. He let us out of the main gate, which was usually locked overnight. We didn't even consider going back to our campsite to retrieve our soaking wet hammocks and gear. We just got in my car and drove. We ended up at a friend's house, sleeping on his living room floor, still damp and shivering. That was the first and last time I ever went camping. The image of that crushed trailer is burned into my mind. I can't help but think about how easily things could have been different. What if we had been standing there? What if that tree had fallen on our car? Or on us? I keep replaying what it would have been like to walk up to that scene and find something far worse than a destroyed trailer. The thought of finding that poor woman's life extinguished in such a random, violent way is terrifying. It was a brutal lesson in how quickly a fun adventure can turn into a tragedy, and how little control we have over the powerful forces of nature. By my junior year of college, I fancied myself a fairly experienced outdoorsman. A few of my fraternity brothers and I had grown tired of the typical spring break scene, the crowded beaches, the overpriced drinks, the manufactured fun. We wanted something real, something more adventurous. So, we planned a week-long backpacking trip in the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina. We pictured ourselves as modern-day explorers, shouldering our heavy packs and disappearing into the solitude of the mountains for a week. The first few days were exactly what we had hoped for. The air was clean and crisp, the trails were challenging, and the views from the ridges were spectacular. We felt 1,000,000 miles away from campus and deadlines. On the third day, we were setting up our camp for the night in a small clearing near a rushing river. We were feeling pretty good about ourselves, having covered a decent number of miles that day. As we were getting our tent set up, we saw 2 men emerge from the woods. They were not fellow backpackers. You could tell that immediately. These were locals, and I mean that in the deepest sense of the word. They looked less like they lived in the mountains, and more like they were a part of them. They were wiry and tough, with faces weathered by sun and wind into something resembling old leather. Their eyes were sharp and suspicious, and they watched us with a deep-seated distrust that seemed reserved for outsiders. They looked like they had been carved out of the very Appalachian trees that surrounded us. As it would turn out, these men were part of a local network that had been actively helping Eric Rudolph, the man responsible for the 1996 Olympic Park bombing, evade a massive FBI manhunt. At that very moment, Rudolph was one of the most wanted men in America, and he was hiding somewhere in the vast, dense wilderness where we were currently trying to set up our tents. We were young and a little naive, so we offered them a spot by our fire. They accepted, watching our every move with those cautious eyes. We had packed a bottle of Jack Daniels, and as the sun went down and the whiskey got passed around, the mood loosened. The conversation, however, started to get progressively stranger. Spurred on by the alcohol, a few of my friends started spouting off some dumb, generic anti-government sentiments, the kind of things college kids say when they're trying to sound edgy. To our surprise, this seemed to be the key that unlocked the two men. They apparently took our drunken ramblings as a sign that we were on their side, that we were kindred spirits who shared their radical and paranoid view of the world. They leaned in closer to the fire, their voices dropping to low, conspiratorial tones. They began to tell us stories. They told us how they, and others like them in the community, viewed Eric Rudolph not as a terrorist, but as a patriot fighting against a corrupt government. They spoke of him with a strange mix of reverence and familiarity. They explained, in detail, how they would leave food drops for him in hidden locations throughout the forest. They described a network of secret caves and caches, allowing him to survive and stay one step ahead of the federal agents who were scouring the mountains for him. At one point, they even offered to take us to one of their primary drop-off spots, a small cave hidden behind a waterfall, not far from our campsite. They said we might even get to meet the man himself. We politely declined their offer. The whiskey buzz had long since worn off, replaced by a cold, creeping unease. The conversation had shifted from weird to genuinely frightening. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any road, sharing a fire with men who were actively aiding one of the country's most notorious fugitives. We felt completely out of our depth, like we had accidentally stumbled into a movie we didn't want to be in. We stayed up with them for a while longer, nodding along and trying to act casual, but the friendly atmosphere was gone. We just wanted them to leave. The next morning, they were gone when we woke up. We quickly packed up our camp, eager to put some distance between ourselves and that clearing. As we were about to leave, they reappeared from the woods. The morning air was tense. As a kind of peace offering, and to ensure we parted on good terms, we gave them the rest of our bottle of Jack Daniels. One of them took it with a grim nod. "We'll give this to Eric next time we see him," he said, and then they disappeared back into the forest. We spent the rest of our trip in a state of nervous anxiety. Every snap of a twig, every shadow in the woods made us jump. We tried to convince ourselves that the two men were just crazy, that they were telling tall tales to scare some college kids. It seemed like the most logical explanation. A few days later, our trip was over. We hiked out of the forest, dirty and exhausted, and drove to the nearest small town. We were starving, so we stopped at a little diner to get some burgers and fries before starting the long drive back to campus. We were sitting in a booth, recounting the story of the two strange men, and laughing about it nervously, when a news report came on the small television, mounted in the corner of the diner. The breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. They had captured Eric Rudolph. My friends and I fell silent, our burgers forgotten on our plates. We stared at the TV, listening intently as the news anchor detailed the capture. He had been found in the early hours of the morning, scavenging for food in a dumpster behind a Piggly Wiggly grocery store. The anchor then showed a map of the area. The grocery store was in a town just 3 miles from where we had met those two men. And it was only 4 miles from the river, where they had offered to take us to the secret cave behind the waterfall. A cold chill washed over me. We just sat there in the diner booth, staring at each other in stunned silence. Everything those two men had told us, which we had desperately tried to dismiss as drunken fantasy, was real. The food drops, the local support network, the general area where he was hiding. It all matched up perfectly with the details of the news report. Those weren't just stories told around a campfire. We had been sitting right in the middle of it all, completely oblivious. Looking back, it's a haunting feeling, knowing we had shared whiskey and a fire with the support system for a domestic terrorist, and had been invited to meet him just days before he was finally brought to justice. For the past decade, A few of my buddies and I have made a point of going winter camping every year in the deep woods of northern Wisconsin. It's a tradition we all look forward to. Most people think we're crazy, but we actually prefer it to summer camping. The world is quieter in the winter. The snow dampens every sound, creating a profound silence that you just can't find any other time of year. There are no bugs, no crowds, just the stark beauty of the snow-covered forest. We don't go to any official park. We have a spot, a remote piece of public land miles from the nearest town that we've been going to for years. Getting there is half the adventure. This particular trip took place a few years ago, during a particularly nasty cold snap. We had managed to get our four-wheel drive trucks back to our spot, but it had been a struggle, even with good tires. The unpaved forest roads were covered in a deep layer of snow and had not been ploughed all winter. It was around 11 o'clock at night. The temperature was already in the single digits and still falling. We were all bundled in our warmest gear, huddled around a big, roaring campfire that threw a circle of warm, dancing light into the overwhelming darkness of the forest. We were nursing our beers and telling the same old stories we always tell, enjoying the simple comfort of the fire and the company. That's when the man walked into our camp. One moment, the edge of the firelight was empty, and the next, he was just standing there. He seemed to have materialized out of the pitch-black woods. The first thing that struck all of us as profoundly strange was that he wasn't carrying a light, no flashlight, no headlamp, nothing. Out here, in the middle of a winter night, miles from anywhere, that's not just unusual, it's practically suicidal. The darkness is absolute. We had seen no other tire tracks on the road in. The nearest town was a good 12 miles away, and the roads were barely passable with our heavy-duty trucks. There was no logical way for him to have gotten here. He was dressed for winter, but not for this kind of severe cold. He wore a simple, worn-out jacket, a pair of jeans, and what looked like regular work boots. It was not the kind of gear that would keep you alive for long in these temperatures. He didn't seem to be shivering, though. He walked calmly toward the fire, as if it were the most normal thing in the world to be taking a stroll through the frozen wilderness at midnight. Despite the bizarre circumstances of his arrival, he seemed friendly. We were all a bit startled, but our Midwestern hospitality kicked in. We offered him a seat on one of the log stumps we used for chairs. He accepted with a quiet nod and sat down, holding his hands out to the flames. We gave him one of our beers, and he took it with a word of thanks. He told us his name was Tom. He made some small talk, commenting on the cold and saying what a nice fire we had. He was well-spoken and seemed perfectly calm, but he was also incredibly vague. We asked if he was camping nearby or if his car had broken down. He just shrugged and said he was just passing through. Passing through to where? From where? He offered no explanation. He stayed for about 45 minutes. He drank his beer, participated in the conversation in a quiet, reserved way, and just seemed to enjoy the warmth of the fire. Then, as abruptly as he had arrived, he stood up. He thanked us for the beer and the fire, turned around, and simply walked away. He walked out of the circle of firelight and vanished back into the impenetrable darkness from which he had come. He moved silently, the snow not even seeming to crunch under his boots. We all just sat there for a moment, completely stunned. We looked at each other, a silent question passing between us. Did that really just happen? We've been exploring that specific block of forest for over a decade. We know the terrain intimately. We know every trail, every ridge, every creek. In the direction he came from and the direction he left in, there is nothing, absolutely nothing. Just miles and miles of dense, unforgiving forest that eventually turns into a vast frozen swamp. There are no cabins, no shelters, no other campsites, nothing. We listened intently, expecting to hear the sound of a snowmobile starting up, or maybe the engine of a truck turning over. We heard only the sound of the wind sighing through the pine trees and the crackle of our fire. There was no other sign of him. I have no rational explanation for that night. It was the middle of February in northern Wisconsin. And the temperature that night dropped to 5 degrees above zero, not counting the wind chill. To be out in that kind of cold, at that time of night, without proper gear, without a light, is a death sentence. Hypothermia would set in quickly. Yet this man seemed completely unfazed by it all. We spent the rest of the night speculating. Was he a ghost? The spirit of a lost logger from 100 years ago? Was he some sort of hermit who had learned to live in harmony with the brutal wilderness? Someone who didn't need our modern gear? Or had we all, sitting around the fire, somehow shared a strange collective hallucination? We'll never know for sure. But the image of that man, Tom, appearing out of the total darkness and then disappearing back into it, is a memory that is permanently frozen in my mind. It left us with the unsettling feeling that there are things in those deep, dark woods that we don't understand, and probably never will. I have a hard time sleeping in tents. Even now, as an adult, the flimsy nylon walls feel less like a shelter and more like a thin, easily breached membrane between me and the night. This fear can be traced back to a single incident on a family camping trip when I was about 10 or 11 years old. We were seasoned family campers. Every summer, we'd load up the station wagon and head to the same state park, a sprawling place with hundreds of campsites packed together in loops, full of families with RVs and pop-up trailers. It was usually a place of comfort and happy memories. This one trip, however, changed that forever. It was late, probably 1 or 2 in the morning, and I was lying wide awake in the tent I shared with my older brother. It was a hot, humid summer night, and the air inside the tent was stuffy and still. I just couldn't get comfortable. I lay on my back, staring up at the dark shape of the tent's ceiling, listening to the familiar symphony of the campground at night. I could hear the distant low hum of someone's generator, the incessant chirping of crickets, and the soft rustle of a breeze moving through the leaves of the trees overhead. It was through this tapestry of normal sounds that I first heard it, a very faint whimper. It was so quiet at first that I thought I might be imagining it, my tired brain playing tricks on me. Our campsite was situated right on the edge of one of the main paved loops, with other campsites crammed in close on all sides. It was probably just a baby crying in a neighboring tent, I told myself. I tried to ignore it, to will myself to fall asleep, but the sound didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, clearer. The whimpering slowly morphed into a soft, unmistakable crying. It was a sound of pure sorrow, deep and heartbreaking. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't the hurried footsteps of someone rushing to the bathroom, or the confident stride of someone walking back to their site. These were slow, shuffling steps, the sound of someone dragging their feet on the asphalt road that ran past our tent. The footsteps came closer and closer, and then they stopped. They stopped right outside our tent, and the crying intensified. It was clearly the sound of a young girl, and she was crying her heart out. It was a desperate, inconsolable sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. The most unsettling part was that the sound was stationary. It wasn't a person walking by our campsite while crying. The footsteps had ceased, and the source of the crying was fixed in one spot, just a few feet from where my head was lying, separated only by a thin layer of canvas. It was as if a little girl was standing at the edge of our gravel pad, staring directly at our tent and just sobbing in the darkness. My heart began to pound in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I was paralyzed with fear, too scared to move, too scared to even take a full breath. I lay there, rigid in my sleeping bag, straining my ears in the oppressive silence between sobs. And then it got so much worse. The heartbreaking crying suddenly and violently escalated into a full-blown, blood-curdling scream. It wasn't a long, drawn-out wail. It was a short, sharp, explosive scream of pure, abject terror. It was a sound of someone seeing something horrifying, and then, just as suddenly as it had erupted, it was cut off. The night plunged back into an abrupt, ringing silence. The scream was so loud and so close that it instantly woke my brother. He shot bolt upright in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide and searching in the darkness. We stared at each other for a beat. a silent, terrified question passing between us. We didn't need to speak. We had both heard it. Without a single word, we both acted on the same primal, childish instinct. We grabbed our pillows, our blankets, anything we could find, and burrowed our heads deep underneath them, as if a layer of cotton and polyester could somehow protect us from whatever horror was lurking just outside our tent. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We just lay there, huddled together for warmth and courage, listening to every tiny sound, our imaginations running wild. We stayed like that until the first faint grey light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, chasing away the deepest of the shadows. The moment we heard our parents stirring in the tent next to ours, we scrambled out and told them what had happened. They tried to calm us down, offering rational explanations like teenagers playing a prank or a wild animal making a strange noise. But I could see the unease in their eyes. They looked spooked, too. We didn't stay for breakfast. We packed up our camp in a hurry and left that morning, a full day earlier than we had planned. I've never been back to that state park. I don't know what we heard that night. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was something terrible happening to someone in the campground. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that even today, years later, I can still hear that girl's terrified scream in my head, as loud and as clear as if it happened just last night. When I was 11, my world was divided into two distinct places, the city where I lived and the Sioux Reservation in South Dakota where my cousins lived. Their world was one of wide open spaces, ancient stories, and a connection to the land that I, a city kid, could only glimpse. My two teenage cousins, who were older and infinitely cooler than me, always seemed to have a new story to tell, usually one designed to scare me. I typically played along, enjoying the thrill of being frightened. But one camping trip, the story felt like it bled into reality. We decided to hike deep into a part of the reservation I had never seen before. It wasn't a place with marked trails or signs. We followed faint animal paths and the landmarks my cousins knew by heart, winding our way through hills and patches of dense forest. We finally reached our destination, a small, secluded clearing, encircled by a silent congregation of tall pine trees. It felt private and ancient. We set up our single tent, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky exploded in shades of orange, pink, and purple. My cousins declared it the perfect time for a ghost story. Gathered inside the tent, they began to tell me about shapeshifters. They spoke in hushed, serious tones about ancient spirits that wandered the plains and forests. These spirits, they said, could take the form of any animal, or even a human. They were most active at dusk, the time between worlds, and they were drawn to people who were alone or lost in the wilderness. As they were reaching the most frightening part of the tale, a strange and beautiful light began to fill the clearing outside. It was a warm, golden glow, unlike any sunset I had ever seen. It was the kind of magical light that sometimes breaks through the clouds after a thunderstorm, making everything it touches seem ethereal and sacred. The golden light bathed our tent, turning the thin nylon walls into a glowing screen. And on that screen, we began to see shadows move. At first, it was captivating. We saw the graceful, elegant shadows of what looked like deer moving silently past our tent. It was like watching a private, natural puppet show. We were mesmerized. But then, the nature of the shadows began to change. They grew larger, their shapes becoming distorted and unsettling. The graceful deer were replaced by the shadow of a large wolf, its form sharp and predatory. Then, an even larger shadow appeared, the unmistakable bulk of a bear. The atmosphere inside the tent had shifted from wonder to a quiet, creeping dread. My cousins had stopped their story. They were now staring at the walls of the tent with the same wide, nervous eyes as me. Their playful, scary story had been interrupted by something genuinely scary. Suddenly, a loud, explosive boom, like a gunshot going off right next to our heads, shattered the silence. In the exact same instant, the shadow of a colossal bird, with a wingspan so vast it seemed to fill the entire side of the tent, swooped down towards us. And then, with a tearing, chaotic sound, The tent itself collapsed on top of us. We were plunged into complete darkness, trapped in a confusing tangle of fabric and poles. Panic set in. My cousins, the ones who were always so calm and tough, started screaming. Their genuine terror amplified my own 100 times over. We thrashed and clawed our way out from under the collapsed tent, not thinking about anything other than escape. We didn't stop to grab our flashlights, our sleeping bags, or any of our gear. We just ran. We scrambled out of the clearing and bolted back the way we came, tearing through the dark, winding trails fueled by pure adrenaline. Branches whipped at our faces and our lungs burned, but we didn't slow down. We didn't stop running until the comforting yellow lights of my aunt and uncle's house appeared through the trees. To this day, I have no idea what truly happened that night. My cousins, who were so eager to tell me scary stories before the trip, have refused to speak a single word about it ever since. Whenever I've tried to bring it up, they shut down the conversation immediately. Maybe there's a logical explanation for it all. A strange weather event, a series of bizarre coincidences, a large branch falling at the exact same time a bird flew by. Maybe our terrified, primed by ghost story minds filled in the blanks and created something supernatural out of mundane events. Or maybe, just maybe, the stories they were telling me weren't just stories. All I know for certain is that I was terrified in a way I have never been before or since, and I have never spent another night sleeping in a tent. My brother, Sam, and I have a shared history of embarking on adventures that are slightly more ambitious than our actual skill sets warrant. A few years ago, we decided we were ready for a primitive camping trip. We chose a remote backcountry section of Big Bend National Park in West Texas. Our goal was to get completely away from everything. No designated campgrounds, no other people, just us and the vast, empty desert. After a long, hot day of hiking under the relentless Texas sun, we found what we believed was the perfect spot. A small, flat clearing tucked away deep in a canyon, miles from any road or marked trail. It was around 12:30 at night. The desert air had cooled significantly, and the sky was a breathtaking spectacle of stars, brighter and clearer than I had ever seen. We were sitting by a small campfire. This fire was in direct violation of the park rules. The ranger who had issued our backcountry permit had been very clear, repeating himself several times about the extreme fire danger and the strict ban on all fires. But we were in our early 20s, full of a sense of invincibility, and decided that a tiny, well-contained fire couldn't possibly hurt anything. We were heating up a can of SpaghettiOs over the flames, feeling immensely proud of our rugged, self-sufficient survival skills. The silence of the canyon was absolute. It was a deep, profound quiet that felt ancient. The only sounds were the soft crackling of our illegal fire and the occasional whisper of a breeze moving through the dry brush. It was in this immense silence that we first heard it. The sound was so faint at first I was sure I was imagining it. It sounded like music. As I strained to listen, the sound became clearer. It was, impossibly, the sound of a woman singing opera. Sam and I both froze. We looked at each other across the fire, our eyes wide with disbelief. The cans of SpaghettiOs were completely forgotten. We sat motionless, listening. The music continued, a beautiful, soaring but utterly terrifying aria that echoed through the empty canyon. The sound seemed to be coming from all around us at once, with no clear source or direction. It was as if the canyon itself was singing. When we picked up our permit that morning, the park ranger had consulted his records and told us specifically that we were the only people registered to be camping in this entire massive section of the park. He had emphasized how lucky we were to have it all to ourselves, how peaceful and isolated it would be. "There's nobody else out there for miles," he had said with a smile. His words replayed in my head, and the beautiful music instantly became the most frightening sound I had ever heard. A logical explanation did not exist. We didn't waste a second considering our options. We simultaneously kicked dirt and sand over our fire, extinguishing the flames and our pride along with it. We abandoned our dinner, our tent, our sleeping bags, everything. We just grabbed our water bottles and ran. We started hiking the 6 miles back to where we had parked our truck, stumbling through the dark canyon, with only the pale, ghostly light of the moon to guide our steps. The entire hike back was a nightmare. The opera music seemed to follow us. It never got any louder or closer, but it was a constant, ethereal presence in the darkness behind us. It was a beautiful, haunting, and deeply unsettling soundtrack to our frantic escape. We could still hear it, faint but clear, until we were about a mile from the parking lot. Then, as suddenly and inexplicably as it had started, the music simply stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was almost as unnerving as the music had been. We finally reached our truck, threw our water bottles in, and peeled out of the dirt parking lot, leaving a cloud of dust in our wake. We never went back for our expensive camping gear. A few days later, we called the park service and told them a fabricated story about animals tearing through our packs and ruining everything. So we just hiked out with what we could carry. I still have no idea what we heard that night. Perhaps it was the ghost of some long-lost prospector's wife. Perhaps it was some other illegal campers deep in the canyon with a battery-powered speaker and a very specific taste in music. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into a neat, logical box. All I know is that the memory of that beautiful, terrifying opera music echoing through the desolate, silent West Texas desert still gives me cold chills whenever I think about it.